Tonight, we are going to explore a very slow and boring history. This story is designed to help you relax, unwind, and gently fall asleep. So find a comfortable position, close your eyes, and let's begin. August 24th, 410. The date means nothing to most people today, but on that night, something broke in the world that has never been fully repaired. Rome's walls had stood for 800 years without an enemy passing through them. 8 centuries of assumed invincibility. Then Alaric arrived with his Visigoths, and in a single night, that assumption shattered. The gates opened. Some say through treachery, others say exhaustion. And the flood began. What followed weren't just 3 days of looting. History records the theft of gold, the taking of slaves, the humiliation of an empire. But there was another theft happening in those 72 hours. One that nobody counted. One that took far longer to understand. While soldiers were dragging silver plates from villas, something infinitely more valuable was disappearing into smoke and chaos. The libraries burned first. Not intentionally, perhaps. Fire spreads fast in a city built mostly of wood, even one decorated in marble. The papyrus scrolls ignited like kindling. Some held poetry, administration records, letters. But others held something different. Technical manuals, engineering treatises, medical texts, architectural specifications. The accumulated knowledge of an empire that had conquered the known world and taken its secrets. In the workshops of the Subura, bronze instruments melted in the flames. These weren't decorative pieces. They were precision tools, surgical equipment, surveying devices, calibrated measuring instruments that took generations to perfect. The craftsmen who made them fled or fell. Either way, the knowledge went with them. There's a specific kind of silence that follows catastrophe. It's not the absence of sound exactly. It's the absence of the sounds that should be there. In the days after Alaric left, Rome was full of noise. Wailing, reconstruction, the arguments of survival. But certain sounds were gone forever. The tap of stonemasons who knew how to cut marble to tolerances we struggle with today. The conversations in scriptoriums where engineers debated load-bearing calculations. The lectures in medical schools where physicians taught procedures that wouldn't be performed again for 1,500 years. Somewhere in those 3 days, an old engineer, perhaps in his 60s, perhaps older, tried to pass his knowledge to a younger man. Maybe it was about the exact mixture of volcanic ash and lime that made Rome's concrete special. Maybe it was the technique for tempering bronze so it held an edge. Maybe it was something we don't even know to ask about. The younger man probably nodded, probably tried to remember. But chaos is a poor classroom. Memory fails under stress. And when that engineer died, maybe that week, maybe that year, the knowledge died too. This happened thousands of times. In thousands of workshops, studies, building sites. Each time, a thread broke in a web of knowledge that had been woven over centuries. The official histories talk about Rome's fall as a political event. Emperors overthrown, territories lost, power fragmented. They're not wrong, but they're not complete. Rome didn't just lose political control that August. It experienced an intellectual apocalypse, the systematic destruction of knowledge infrastructure that took a millennium to accumulate. We call what followed the Dark Ages. The term itself suggests we know what happened: a dimming, a simplification, a forgetting. But what if that's not quite right? What if the darkness wasn't ignorance spreading, but knowledge being extinguished? What if medieval Europe wasn't primitive because people were less intelligent, but because they'd lost the instruction manuals? What if the Dark Ages weren't about forgetting how to read, but about losing technologies so advanced that even today, with all our science and computers and materials analysis, we still struggle to recreate them? That's the question that keeps historians up at night, and it's the question we're going to answer. But first, we need to understand exactly what was lost. What did Rome actually know? And why did it disappear so completely? Start with something simple. Concrete. You've seen it your entire life. Sidewalks, buildings, foundations. Basic building material. Invented relatively recently, refined through modern chemistry, improved over time as we've learned more about materials science. That's the story you were taught. Except Rome was making concrete 2,000 years ago, and theirs was better than ours. Not slightly better, not equivalent with some trade-offs, actually superior in ways that modern engineers openly admit they don't fully understand. Roman concrete doesn't just last longer than modern concrete. It actively gets stronger over time, especially underwater. Modern concrete exposed to seawater begins degrading within decades. Roman harbors built 2 millennia ago are still intact. The concrete still sound, still doing its job. We didn't discover this through ancient texts. We found out by accident. In 2017, researchers studying Roman maritime structures realized that seawater wasn't destroying the concrete. It was triggering a chemical reaction that created new crystalline structures in the material. The concrete was healing itself, growing stronger. 2,000 years later. Modern engineers still can't replicate this reliably at scale. We know the general principles now. We understand the chemistry. But knowing and doing are different things. The Pantheon sits in Rome with a dome that remains the world's largest, unreinforced concrete dome, larger than any modern concrete dome built without steel reinforcement. It's been standing for 1,900 years. The concrete at the top is lighter than the concrete at the base, suggesting Romans understood material science in ways that seem impossible for their time. They had hydraulic mining technology that could collapse entire mountains. They'd build aqueducts into mineral-rich ranges, then release massive volumes of water through tunnels they dug into the rock. The hydraulic pressure would shatter the mountain from inside, washing out thousands of tons of gold-bearing ore. The landscape at Las Medulas in Spain still looks alien from what they did there. They moved more earth than the volume of the Great Pyramid. Then we forgot how to do it for 1,500 years. Roman medical instruments discovered in Pompeii, preserved exactly where they were left when Vesuvius erupted, are virtually identical to modern surgical tools. The scalpels have the same blade angles. The forceps have the same mechanisms. Bone saws with similar tooth patterns. Speculums, catheters, tools for cataract surgery, not primitive approximations. Refined instruments that look like they came from a modern operating room. They had glass that allegedly could bend without breaking. Multiple ancient sources describe a craftsman demonstrating flexible glass to an emperor, who then had him executed and his workshop destroyed, so the material wouldn't devalue precious metals. True story or cautionary tale? We're not certain. But we do know Romans created glass with gold nanoparticles suspended in it at sizes between 50 and 100 nanometers. Technology we didn't redevelop until the late 20th century. The Lycurgus cup in the British Museum changes color depending on the light source because of these nanoparticles. We can see it. We can measure it. We still struggle to recreate it intentionally. Their aqueducts calculated water flow to within millimeters per kilometer over distances of 50 miles or more. Some still function today. The Aqua Virgo still supplies the Trevi Fountain. 2,000 years of continuous operation. None of this is fringe theory or alternative archaeology. These are documented facts that mainstream historians and scientists acknowledge. You can visit these structures. You can examine these artifacts in museums. Peer-reviewed research from MIT and Berkeley confirms the concrete's properties. The medical instruments are photographed and catalogued, yet somehow this knowledge sits in footnotes rather than headlines. We're taught that history is progress, that we build on what came before, always moving forward. But what if that's not true? What if we lost something extraordinary and spent more than a millennium just trying to get back to where Rome already was? The real question isn't whether these technologies existed. The evidence is overwhelming. The question is, how did Rome discover them in the first place? Rome didn't invent most of what made it extraordinary. It took what others had built, refined it, scaled it, and centralized it in a way no civilization had before. This wasn't primitive plundering. It was systematic knowledge extraction on an industrial scale. When Rome absorbed Egypt in 30 BCE, they weren't just securing grain supplies. They were accessing engineering principles that stretched back 3,000 years to the Old Kingdom. Egyptian architects had built structures that defied explanation. The precision of the Great Pyramid's construction, the astronomical alignments, the stonework tolerances. Roman engineers studied these monuments not as tourists, but as students. They brought Egyptian engineers back to Rome, sometimes as slaves, often as well-compensated experts. The knowledge transfer was deliberate and organized. Greece fell to Rome earlier, and with it came something even more valuable than architecture: mathematical principles, astronomical observations, hydraulic engineering, medical knowledge from Hippocrates and his followers. The Romans didn't just conquer Greek cities. They absorbed Greek thinkers. They brought scholars to Rome, established them in positions of influence, paid them to teach, to write, to consult on projects. When a Greek physician named Galen arrived in Rome, he became one of the most influential medical authorities in history. His knowledge came from centuries of Greek medical tradition. Rome provided the platform, the resources, the demand. But it went beyond Egypt and Greece. When legions marched into Hispania, engineers marched with them. Their job wasn't combat, it was observation. They studied Carthaginian mining techniques, documented local irrigation systems, mapped the engineering solutions that indigenous peoples had developed over centuries. These weren't casual observations noted in journals. These were technical surveys conducted by trained specialists. The Library of Apollo on the Palatine Hill became a repository for this accumulated knowledge. Engineering treatises from across the Mediterranean, agricultural manuals from Carthage, medical texts from Alexandria, architectural specifications from Athens. This wasn't a collection of literature, it was a technical database. The library held the concentrated expertise of dozens of civilizations spanning thousands of years. Rome's military campaigns served dual purposes. Territorial expansion, yes, but also knowledge acquisition. When Rome conquered Gaul, they studied Celtic metalworking. The Gauls had sophisticated techniques for producing iron and steel that Romans incorporated into their own methods. When they pushed into Germania, they encountered different building techniques adapted to colder climates, different approaches to forestry and timber construction. Always the engineers were there, watching, learning, documenting. This created something unprecedented. A single civilization that held the technical knowledge of the entire known world. Rome became a crossroads where an architect trained in Greek methods might collaborate with an Egyptian engineer, applying Carthaginian innovations to a project funded with Hispanian gold. But concentration creates vulnerability. Put all your gold in one vault and thieves have a single target. Store all your knowledge in one civilization, and if that civilization falls, everything goes with it. When Rome collapsed, it wasn't just Roman discoveries that vanished. It was Egyptian mathematics preserved in Alexandrian libraries. It was Greek medical knowledge maintained in Roman schools. It was Carthaginian engineering kept alive through Roman practice. It was mining techniques from Hispania, metallurgy from Gaul, architectural principles from a dozen cultures, all filtered through and preserved by Roman institutions. The wisdom of the ancient Mediterranean world, accumulated over 3,000 years from dozens of civilizations, depended on Roman infrastructure to survive. The libraries, the schools, the workshops, the master-apprentice systems, the funding, the demand. When those systems broke, the knowledge scattered like light through a shattered lens. Some fragments survived. Many didn't. This is why Rome's fall was so catastrophic for human knowledge. It wasn't one culture losing its innovations. It was the collapse of a civilizational repository that held secrets from empires that no longer existed to preserve them independently. Now that we understand how Rome accumulated this knowledge, we can begin to explore what was lost. And we start with the technology that even modern science struggles to explain. The concrete that should have crumbled 2,000 years ago, but instead grows stronger with every passing century. Stand inside the Pantheon on a clear afternoon, and you'll understand why some mysteries refuse to stay buried. Light pours through the oculus, that perfect circular opening at the dome's apex, and falls in a solid column to the floor below. The shaft of light moves across the interior as the day progresses, illuminating different sections of the ancient space, revealing and concealing in turn. The dome above you spans 142 feet. No pillars support it. No steel reinforcement holds it together. Just concrete, poured nearly 1900 years ago, still performing exactly as intended. Still bearing its own weight without complaint, without compromise, without the hairline fractures that would terrify modern structural engineers. When engineers in the 1950s finally got permission to study the Pantheon properly, they brought their instruments, their calculations, their confidence. They measured, analyzed, modeled. Then they encountered a problem. According to their mathematics, the dome shouldn't exist. The span was too large. The concrete too heavy. The structure should have collapsed under its own weight centuries ago, if not during construction itself. But there it stands. And the engineers, eventually, had to adjust their assumptions about what was possible. Look closer at the dome, and you'll notice something subtle. The concrete changes as you move from base to apex. At the bottom, it's heavier, denser, mixed with travertine and brick fragments. As your eyes travel upward, the concrete becomes lighter. At the top, near the oculus, it's made with pumice, volcanic rock full of air pockets. The entire dome is a gradient of carefully calibrated densities. This wasn't accident or luck. Romans understood that different parts of the structure experienced different stresses. They adjusted their mixture accordingly, creating a dome that distributed weight precisely, perfectly. This kind of material science sophistication wasn't supposed to exist in the ancient world. Yet here it is, overhead, undeniable. The pour itself raises questions nobody has fully answered. The dome was cast in a single continuous operation. No seams, no joints where different pours meet. That means coordinating hundreds of workers, maintaining quality control over massive quantities of material, ensuring consistency throughout the entire process. One mistake, one bad batch of concrete, one lapse in precision, and the whole project fails. They didn't have computers to model stress patterns. They didn't have chemical analysis to verify mixture ratios. They had knowledge, experience, and a level of organizational capability that makes modern project managers uncomfortable. But the Pantheon, impressive as it is, represents just one application of Roman concrete technology. The real mystery emerges when you look at their maritime structures, the harbors, breakwaters, and ports that sustained an empire. At Caesarea, Portus, by eye, Roman concrete sits underwater, has been underwater for 2,000 years, constantly exposed to salt water, wave action, chemical erosion, everything that destroys modern concrete in decades. Engineers who study underwater infrastructure know that concrete in seawater has a limited lifespan. 50 years is good. 100 is exceptional. 2,000 is impossible. Except it isn't impossible. It's there, still intact, still functional in some cases. Modern scientists have taken samples, analyzed them in laboratories, published findings in peer-reviewed journals. MIT, Berkeley, institutions with reputations to protect. And what they found doesn't make sense according to what we think we know about materials science. Roman maritime concrete doesn't decay, it strengthens. Over time, seawater infiltration triggers a crystallization process that actually reinforces the material. The concrete heals itself, grows denser, becomes more durable with age. Modern concrete does the opposite. Seawater breaks it down, creating cracks that widen, weaknesses that compound, eventual catastrophic failure. This isn't ancient astronaut speculation or fringe archaeology. This is documented, measured, confirmed reality that challenges our assumptions about technological progress. The Romans built structures that outlast our best modern equivalents, not by a little, by orders of magnitude. So what made their concrete different? The answer lies not in what they added, but in what they didn't know they were creating. A chemical reaction that modern science only discovered by accident in 2013. The formula seems simple when you first hear it. Volcanic ash from Pozzuoli Bay near Naples. Lime, seawater. Mix in the right proportions. Pour, wait. That's the recipe dozens of ancient texts mention, the one that's been available to historians for centuries. So why couldn't anyone recreate it? Because recipes lie. Or rather, they tell the truth incompletely. A recipe for bread tells you flour, water, yeast, salt, but it doesn't tell you the feel of properly kneaded dough, the subtle signs that fermentation has progressed far enough, the way good bread sounds when you tap the crust. That knowledge lives in hands and experience, passed from baker to apprentice through demonstration and repetition. Roman concrete was the same. The text told what to mix, but not how to mix it. Not the precise ratios, not which specific volcanic ash, from which specific location, not the timing, or the temperature, or the 100 small details that separated adequate concrete from the extraordinary material that could last millennia. The magic happens at the molecular level, in spaces too small to see without modern electron microscopes. When seawater penetrates Roman concrete, and it does, slowly, over decades and centuries, it encounters the volcanic ash particles. A chemical reaction begins. Rare crystals start forming. Aluminum tobermorite, a mineral so uncommon in nature that geologists get excited finding small samples. These crystals grow in the tiny voids and cracks within the concrete matrix. They fill gaps. They bind loose particles. They create new structural connections stronger than what was there before. The concrete doesn't just resist decay. It actively repairs itself, slowly, continuously growing more robust with each passing year. Modern concrete works differently. Portland cement, invented in the 1800s, creates a different chemical structure. Strong initially, but vulnerable to seawater. Salt infiltration breaks down the bonds, creates expansive pressures, widens cracks. The process accelerates. What starts as microscopic weakness becomes visible damage, becomes structural failure. We know this now because scientists in 2013, studying samples from Roman harbors, finally figured out what was happening. They identified the tobermorite crystals, traced the chemical pathways, understood the self-healing mechanism. Knowledge that was obvious to Roman engineers became cutting-edge research in the 21st century. But knowing why something works and knowing how to make it work are different challenges entirely. Scientists can produce Roman-style concrete in laboratories. They can control conditions, source the right materials, create small batches with the desired properties. Scaling that to industrial production is another matter. The volcanic ash matters. Not just any volcanic ash. The specific pozzolana from certain deposits with particular mineral compositions. The proportions matter. precise enough that slight variations produce different results. The mixing process matters, the curing time, the ambient conditions. Our entire modern construction industry is built around Portland cement. Switching would mean retooling factories, retraining workers, rewriting building codes, establishing new supply chains. Sometimes losing knowledge means losing more than information. It means losing the infrastructure, the economic systems, the institutional frameworks that made the knowledge useful. Roman concrete wasn't just a formula, it was an industry, quarries, transportation networks, skilled labor pools, quality standards, inspection systems, master craftsmen who trained apprentices over years. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed, the building economy collapsed with it. No major public works projects meant no demand for specialized concrete. No demand meant no reason to maintain the supply chains or train new workers. The guild system that preserved craft knowledge dissolved within a generation. By 600 CE, maybe sooner, the last master who knew the exact formulas was dead. The knowledge died too. Medieval builders knew Romans had accomplished impressive things. They could see the structures, walk inside them, recognize the scale and ambition. But they assumed it was better craftsmanship, more labor, superior organization. They didn't realize the Romans were working with fundamentally different materials. The concrete itself was different at the molecular level. Without that understanding, replication was impossible. We rediscovered the secret 1500 years after it was lost, and we're still working on bringing it back. Some knowledge, once broken, doesn't reassemble easily. The Portus Harbour complex sits northwest of Rome. Mostly buried now, its ancient waterways filled with centuries of silt. But under the earth and water, Roman concrete endures. This was Rome's lifeline, the artificial port that received grain ships from Egypt, the logistics hub that fed 1 million people. The harbour's breakwaters stretch for thousands of feet. Massive concrete structures poured directly underwater 2,000 years ago. Modern engineers look at Portus and see something that shouldn't work. Pouring concrete underwater is challenging, even with contemporary technology. You need cofferdams or caissons to create dry working areas, pumps to keep water out, careful curing conditions to ensure proper hardening. Romans apparently skipped most of that. They developed a hydraulic concrete that could set and strengthen while completely submerged in seawater. The breakwaters are still there, still intact despite 2 millennia of wave action, storms, salt exposure, everything that destroys modern maritime concrete within decades. The concrete hasn't just survived, it's thrived. Those tobermorite crystals forming and reforming, the structure actually gaining strength from the seawater that should have destroyed it. Compare this to modern ports. Engineers expect underwater concrete to last maybe 50 years in good conditions. 100 years is exceptional, requiring careful maintenance and favorable circumstances. The concrete at Portus has outlasted 50 generations of modern concrete 20 times over. And it's not alone. Walk to the Trevi Fountain in Rome, and you're watching water flow through concrete channels that have been working continuously for 2,000 years. The Aqua Virgo aqueduct still carries water from its source to the fountain, following the path Roman engineers calculated with precision, measured in millimeters per kilometer, over distances of miles. The concrete conduits show where, certainly, algae growth, calcium deposits, but no structural degradation, no catastrophic failures requiring complete replacement. Just steady, reliable function across 20 centuries. Think about that time frame. 2,000 years ago, the Roman Empire was approaching its peak. Jesus had been dead for barely a generation. The aqueduct built then is still doing its job now, with most of its original concrete intact. What infrastructure are we building today that will function in the year 4000? Or consider the baths of Caracalla, massive public bathing complexes where thousands gathered daily. The concrete vaults span spaces large enough to echo, wide enough that you instinctively look for support pillars that aren't there. These baths operated with extreme temperature variations: hot water, cold water, steam rooms, heated floors. Concrete expanding and contracting with thermal cycles, day after day, year after year. Modern concrete cracks under such stress. Thermal expansion creates pressure. Cracks form. Water infiltrates. Freezing and thawing widen the damage. Eventually, catastrophic failure. Engineers design modern structures with expansion joints, steel reinforcement, careful temperature management to minimize thermal stress. The baths of Caracalla had none of that. Just concrete, performing flawlessly under conditions that should have destroyed it. The engineering implications extend beyond durability. Romans could build thin shell vaults, concrete arches and domes with remarkably slender profiles. Modern engineers need steel reinforcement to achieve similar spans. Without it, the concrete is too brittle, too prone to cracking. Roman concrete apparently wasn't. They created monolithic structures that behaved like single pieces of stone, distributing loads evenly, handling stress without the failure modes that plague contemporary concrete. These weren't experimental prototypes. These were industrial-scale projects repeated across the empire. Hundreds of harbors, thousands of aqueducts, countless buildings and baths and bridges, all using consistent methodology, standardized materials, reliable techniques. That level of quality control suggests sophisticated understanding of materials science, not luck or trial and error. When this knowledge vanished, European building technology didn't just stagnate, it regressed. Medieval cathedrals are magnificent, but they're built with stone masonry because no one remembered how to make Roman concrete. The techniques, the materials, the underlying principles, all forgotten. It took until the 1800s to develop Portland cement, and even that represents different chemistry, different properties, different engineering approaches. In some ways, we still haven't caught up. We can build taller, certainly, larger, but 2,000 years from now, our structures will be dust. Roman concrete will still be standing, still getting stronger, still defying our assumptions about what's possible. If Roman concrete seems impossibly advanced, wait until you learn about Roman glass. Specifically, the type of glass that could bend without breaking, and then disappeared so completely that we're still not sure it ever existed. The story appears in multiple ancient sources, which is unusual. When several historians independently mention the same event, it suggests something happened, even if the details blur with retelling. Pliny the Elder recorded it. So did Petronius. Dio Cassius referenced it centuries later. The specifics vary. Some say it was Emperor Tiberius. Others claim Nero. But the core narrative remains consistent. A craftsman came before the emperor carrying a bowl. Glass, he explained, but not ordinary glass. He demonstrated by dropping it. The bowl hit the floor with a metallic clang. It dented. The emperor and his court leaned forward. Glass doesn't dent. Glass shatters. The craftsman picked up the bowl and, using a small hammer, tapped the dent back into shape. The glass reformed, flawless, as if nothing had happened. He called it vitrum flexile, flexible glass. Glass that behaved like metal, malleable, repairable, essentially unbreakable. The emperor asked the obvious question. Did anyone else know this secret? The craftsman, perhaps proud, perhaps naive, said no. Only he possessed the formula. He'd come to the emperor first, before revealing it to the world, expecting reward and recognition. The emperor had him executed immediately, then ordered the craftsman's workshop destroyed. Every tool, every material, every scrap of knowledge that might hint at the process, obliterated. The official reasoning, according to the sources, was economic. Unbreakable glass would devalue gold and silver. If common people could own vessels as durable as precious metal, the entire luxury economy would collapse. Better to kill one man than destabilize an empire. The secret died with him, if it ever existed at all. Historians debate this story endlessly. Some dismiss it as allegory, a cautionary tale about innovation threatening power, about emperors who feared change. Others point out that multiple independent sources, lending weight that pure fiction rarely achieves. Ancient writers invented morality tales regularly, but they usually signaled them as such. These accounts read like history, not parable. Modern materials scientists have theories. Glass-ceramic composites, perhaps, where glass is fused with metal oxides in precise ratios. The process creates materials with properties between glass and metal. We've developed such materials recently, but they require sophisticated temperature control and understanding of molecular structures. Could Romans have stumbled onto similar chemistry through empirical experimentation? Or maybe it was an early form of tempered glass. Modern tempering involves heating glass to specific temperatures, then rapidly cooling it, creating internal stresses that make the material much stronger and more flexible than ordinary glass. We didn't perfect this until the 20th century, but the principle is simple enough that accidental discovery isn't impossible. Corning developed willow glass in the 2010s, a flexible glass that can bend without breaking, used in electronic displays and curved screens. The chemistry involves manipulating the glass structure at the molecular level, controlling crystal formation during cooling. It's cutting-edge technology, but it works. Flexible glass exists, which raises an uncomfortable question. If we can make it now, why couldn't Romans have made it then? Different process, different understanding, but similar results. They had sophisticated glass technology. We'll explore that shortly. They had high temperature furnaces. They had centuries of empirical knowledge about how different additives changed glass properties. Trial and error, conducted over generations, can discover things that theoretical science takes centuries to explain. We've already seen Romans had chemical processes that seem impossibly advanced. Concrete that heals itself through crystallization reactions at the molecular level. They didn't understand why it worked, but they perfected it anyway. Why not glass? The execution part adds credibility, strangely. It explains why the technology vanished so completely. No time to train apprentices. No opportunity for the knowledge to spread. Just sudden, absolute elimination of everyone who knew the secret. If the story is true, we lost flexible glass, not through gradual forgetting, but through deliberate destruction. Knowledge murdered in an instant. We'll never know for certain. The evidence is fragmentary, the sources ancient and uncertain, but dismissing it entirely feels premature. Rome surprised us with concrete. Perhaps they surprised themselves with glass. Whether or not flexible glass existed, we know for certain that Romans created types of glass we've only recently begun to understand. And some of it has properties that still puzzle scientists today. The Lycurgus cup sits in the British Museum, looking unremarkable in ambient light. Jade green, pleasant enough, but nothing extraordinary. Just an ancient glass cup with carved decorations showing King Lycurgus entangled in vines, a scene from Greek mythology rendered in 4th century Roman craftsmanship. Then someone shines a light through it from behind. The cup transforms. The green vanishes, replaced by deep, translucent red. Not a trick of shadows or reflection. The glass itself changes color, depending on whether light bounces off it or passes through it. For centuries, nobody understood how this was possible. The cup was admired, studied, catalogued, but the mechanism remained mysterious. Glass doesn't normally do this. You can tint glass with various minerals. Cobalt for blue, manganese for purple. But that creates a fixed color. The Lycurgus cup actively responds to light conditions, shifting between completely different hues. In the 1990s, scientists got permission to examine tiny fragments under electron microscopes. What they found shouldn't exist in ancient glass. Nanoparticles, gold and silver, crushed or dissolved down to sizes between 50 and 100 nanometers. Far too small to see with the naked eye. Barely visible even under powerful magnification. These particles, suspended throughout the glass matrix, interact with light at the wavelength level. When light hits them from different angles, they absorb, reflect, and transmit specific wavelengths, creating the color-changing effect through a phenomenon called dichroism. The physics is complex, but the result is unmistakable. Here's what makes this extraordinary. Nanoparticles at those precise sizes don't occur naturally. You can't accidentally get 50 nanometer gold particles by grinding metal. The particles would be too large, too irregular. Creating uniform nanoparticles requires controlling chemistry and temperature with precision we didn't achieve until the late 20th century. Yet there they are, in a cup made 1700 years ago. Romans created nanotechnology, almost certainly without understanding what they were creating. They knew that adding certain materials in certain ways produced glass that changed color. They perfected the technique through generations of trial and error, refining proportions and processes until they got consistent results. But they couldn't have known they were manipulating matter at the nanoscale. The Lycurgus cup isn't unique. It's just the most famous surviving example. Roman glassmakers produced purple glass using manganese and gold compounds in ways we're still deciphering. They created cage cups, diatrita in Latin, where the decorative outer layer is separated from the inner vessel by mere millimeters, connected only by tiny bridges. The precision cutting required seems impossible with ancient tools. One mistake, one crack, and months of work shatter. They made glass cameos with multiple colored layers, carving through them to create images where different layers provided different hues. The layer adhesion had to be perfect, the thickness consistent, the cutting flawless. Modern attempts to replicate these using period-appropriate tools fail more often than they succeed. Archaeological evidence shows that Roman glassmaking centers in Egypt and Syria were producing high-quality glass industrially, not just as luxury items. Thousands of pieces, standardized forms, consistent quality. This wasn't rare artisan work. This was manufacturing, which means the knowledge was widespread, taught systematically, refined across generations. The question haunts researchers. What else could they make? Glass is fragile. 2,000 years of wars, fires, accidents, and simple carelessness have destroyed most Roman glass. Museums hold maybe thousands of intact pieces, but Romans made millions. Tens of millions, perhaps. We're seeing a tiny, non-representative sample. The sturdy pieces, the buried pieces, the lucky pieces that somehow survived. What other techniques did they master that left no trace because the evidence shattered? What colors? What properties? What applications existed, but vanished completely? The Lycurgus cup survived because it was valuable enough to protect, sturdy enough to endure. How many less durable marvels turned to dust or fragments nobody bothered preserving? Every few years, archaeologists find Roman glass that reveals new capabilities. A composition nobody had seen before. A technique nobody realized they'd mastered. Each discovery suggests we've been underestimating their abilities, assuming our glass technology represents humanity's first achievement of such sophistication. But the Romans were there first, making nanoparticles, controlling light at the wavelength level, creating effects we needed electron microscopes to understand. And most of what they knew is gone, shattered and lost, leaving us to puzzle over the fragments that remain. Glassmaking in the Roman world was concentrated in specific centers. Alexandria in Egypt, famous for its glassworkers since Ptolemaic times. Sidon on the coast of Syria, where craftsmen developed techniques that spread throughout the empire. The Rhine frontier, where Roman glassmakers served military markets and local populations. These weren't casual workshops. They were specialized industries requiring specific knowledge, rare materials, and infrastructure most towns couldn't support. The techniques were closely guarded, not through official secrecy necessarily, but through the nature of craft knowledge itself. A master glassmaker would take an apprentice, usually a family member, and teach them over years. How to judge temperature by sight and sound, when to add flux, how much colorant, the rhythm of blowing and shaping, the timing of annealing. Knowledge that lived in hands and eyes, not in written instructions. Making glass requires materials that aren't universally available. High-purity silica sand, free from iron impurities that would discolor the final product. Plant ash or natron for flux to lower the melting point. Various metal oxides for coloring. Cobalt for blue. Copper for green. Manganese for purple. Some of these came from specific sources, sometimes hundreds of miles away. Glass required trade networks. It also required heat. Sustained, controlled heat at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees. Roman furnaces achieved this through careful design, proper draft, refractory linings, efficient fuel consumption. Building such furnaces was specialized knowledge itself. Medieval Europe initially couldn't match it. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed, long-distance trade fractured. The glass-making centers, dependent on materials from across the Mediterranean, lost access to their supply chains. Silica from one region, flux from another, colorants from a third. When the network broke, production stopped. Without market demand for luxury goods, without the economic surplus to support specialized craftsmen, the industry contracted and then collapsed. Medieval Europe forgot how to make clear glass. For centuries, European glassmakers could only produce forest glass, cloudy, greenish, full of impurities. It was functional enough for windows in churches and castles, but it was nothing like Roman crystalline glass, which was so clear it was nearly invisible. Venetian glassmakers on the island of Murano eventually rediscovered some techniques. By the 13th and 14th centuries, they were producing high-quality glass again, celebrated throughout Europe. But even at its peak, Venetian glass couldn't replicate all Roman achievements. The crystal-clear glass Romans called crystalline wasn't matched until England developed lead glass in the 1600s, adding lead oxide to the mixture, creating brilliance and clarity through different chemistry than Romans had used. Modern experimental archaeologists try to recreate Roman glass using period-appropriate materials and methods. They build replica furnaces based on archaeological remains. They source similar raw materials. They study ancient glass fragments to understand composition. Sometimes they succeed in making glass that looks convincingly Roman. But chemical analysis reveals subtle differences. The trace elements aren't quite right. The nanoparticle distribution in colored glass doesn't match. The precision Romans achieved, especially in pieces like the Lycurgus cup, remains difficult to replicate intentionally. This illustrates a broader principle about lost technology. It's not just about forgetting a recipe. It's about losing an entire ecosystem of knowledge. The apprentice training systems, the networks that supplied specific raw materials, the fuel sources. Roman glassmakers used specific woods that produced sustained, even heat. The market demand that justified specializing in such challenging work. The cultural values that made master craftsmen respected and prosperous enough to invest years training the next generation. When multiple links in that chain break simultaneously, as happened during Rome's collapse, reconstruction becomes extraordinarily difficult, even when you have the finished products to study. You can analyze a piece of Roman glass down to its molecular structure, understand exactly what's in it, and still struggle to recreate it. Because making glass isn't just chemistry, it's timing, temperature control, technique, experience, tacit knowledge that evaporates when the tradition breaks. Medieval Europe eventually rebuilt its glass industry, but it took 1,000 years to relearn what Rome knew. And we're still missing pieces. Still finding Roman glass that reveals capabilities we hadn't realized they possessed. Still discovering that what we thought were recent innovations might be rediscoveries of techniques that existed and vanished 2 millennia ago. If watching Roman glass technology disappear feels frustrating, the loss of their hydraulic engineering is even more remarkable. Because Roman water systems didn't just supply drinking water, they powered industry, washed away disease, and literally moved mountains. And some of those systems still function 2,000 years later. Stand beneath the Pont du Gard in southern France and look up. 3 tiers of arches rise nearly 50 meters above the Garden River. Honey-colored stone stacked with precision that makes modern engineers uncomfortable. The bottom tier has 6 arches. The middle tier has 11. The top tier, narrow and high, has 35 smaller arches carrying the water channel itself. That channel is the remarkable part. Follow it with your eyes across the valley. Imagine the water flowing through it 2,000 years ago, and you're looking at mathematics made stone. The gradient descends at a ratio of 1 to 3,000. In practical terms, the channel drops 2.5 centimeters per kilometer. Over the entire 50-kilometer length from source to Nîmes, the total elevation change is barely more than 12 meters. Think about what that precision requires. A gradient too steep, and you waste the potential energy of falling water, energy that could power mills or fountains. Too shallow, and the water stagnates or doesn't flow at all. Romans calculated the exact slope that would move water efficiently without waste. Then they maintained that gradient over 50 kilometers of varying terrain, through hills, across valleys, around obstacles. They did this without computers, without laser levels, without GPS or digital surveying equipment. They had the groma for establishing right angles, the chorobates for leveling, plumb lines and water levels. Simple tools requiring deep understanding to use effectively. The mathematics was done by hand, the measurements verified by eye and experience. And they got it right. Rome itself had 11 major aqueducts by the imperial period. Together, they delivered over 1 million cubic meters of water daily to a city of roughly 1 million people. That's more water per capita than most modern cities provide. The engineering wasn't just about volume. It was about distribution, quality control, maintenance systems. The aqueducts incorporated settling tanks where sediment dropped out before water continued downstream. Siphons used gravity and pressure to push water uphill across valleys when arching wasn't practical. Distribution systems branched from main channels into networks of lead and terracotta pipes serving different districts. Some installations had rudimentary water meters, bronze devices that measured flow to charge wealthy households for usage. What makes this more remarkable is durability. These weren't temporary solutions or minimally functional infrastructure. The Aqua Virgo, built in 19 BCE, still carries water into Rome, still supplies the Trevi fountain. 20 centuries of continuous operation. That's not maintenance preserving ancient ruins. That's original Roman engineering still doing its job. Portions of the Segovia aqueduct in Spain remained in active use until the 1800s, not as historical curiosity, as functioning infrastructure meeting a modern city's needs. The Romans built it so well that for 2,000 years, nobody found reason to replace it. Compare this to modern infrastructure. Concrete bridges last maybe 50 to 70 years before requiring major repairs or replacement. Water mains fail after decades. We design for planned obsolescence, for repair cycles, for eventual replacement. The notion of building infrastructure that will function for 2 millennia doesn't enter contemporary planning discussions. Roman water engineering wasn't just about moving liquid from point A to point B. It represented integrated understanding of hydrology, topography, materials science, urban planning, public health, and long-term thinking. They weren't solving immediate problems. They were building for centuries. The knowledge required was comprehensive, understanding how water behaves under different pressures, knowing which materials resist corrosion and erosion, calculating structural loads for massive stone arches, surveying routes across mountains and valleys, managing construction logistics, training workers, maintaining completed works. This knowledge was systematic, teachable, replicable. Hundreds of aqueducts were built across the empire using consistent principles and techniques. From Britain to Syria, from North Africa to the Rhine frontier, Roman aqueducts followed similar designs and achieved similar results. That standardization indicates sophisticated technical education, not scattered genius. When you stand beneath the Pont du Gard today, you're not looking at a relic. You're looking at engineering that still makes sense, that still functions, that still commands respect. 2,000 years haven't diminished it. Time has only proven how far beyond their era the Romans were working. But aqueducts were just the visible part of Roman water mastery. The really revolutionary technology, the one that changed landscapes forever, happened underground and underwater, where few people saw it. And it was brutal. The landscape at Las Medulas in northwest Spain looks wrong. Red earth carved into impossible formations, vertical cliffs with no apparent reason, collapsed hillsides frozen in the moment of their ancient destruction. The terrain resembles something from another planet, hostile and alien. This isn't natural erosion. This is what remains after Romans used water as a weapon against the earth itself. They called it ruina montium, the ruin of mountains. The name was accurate. This was hydraulic mining on a scale that wouldn't be matched for 1,500 years, and when it was finally reinvented, the results were catastrophic because the knowledge of how to do it properly had been lost. The technique began with aqueducts, not the familiar stone arches supplying cities, but smaller channels built specifically for mining operations. Engineers would construct networks bringing massive volumes of water from distant sources into mountainous regions rich with gold. The channels followed the topography, sometimes spanning dozens of kilometers, accumulating water in reservoirs positioned above the target area. Meanwhile, other workers dug tunnels into the gold-bearing mountainside. Dozens of tunnels, sometimes hundreds, honeycomb marked the rock. These weren't mine shafts for extracting ore. They were structural weaknesses, deliberate fracture points. When the tunnels were ready, the engineers opened the reservoirs. Millions of gallons of water, released suddenly under enormous pressure, roared through the tunnels. The hydraulic force shattered rock, collapsed chambers, destabilized the entire mountainside. The mountain fell apart from inside, washing thousands of tons of gold-bearing ore down specially constructed channels where it could be processed in lower elevation sluices. At Las Medulas alone, Romans extracted an estimated 20 tons of gold over 250 years. To get that gold, they moved more than 100 million cubic meters of earth, a volume exceeding the Great Pyramid of Giza. The landscape was permanently transformed. Valleys filled with spoil, hillsides lapsed into canyons, water channels scarring the terrain like wounds that never healed. And Las Medulas was just one site. Romans used ruina montium across Hispania, in Britannia, in Dacia. Anywhere mountains held gold and water could be brought to bear. This technology reshaped the land. The engineering requirements were sophisticated. You couldn't just flood tunnels and hope for collapse. That might cause the wrong sections to fail, burying workers or wasting effort. Engineers had to understand geological stability, calculate which rock formations would fracture predictably, design tunnel systems that would channel force effectively. Water pressure dynamics became critical. The reservoirs had to be positioned correctly to generate sufficient pressure. The release mechanisms had to handle violent flows without failing. The receiving channels had to withstand erosive forces that would normally destroy them. This wasn't crude technology accidentally succeeding. This was controlled catastrophic failure, engineered precisely. Modern engineers look at ruina montium and see the ancient ancestor of hydraulic fracturing. The principle is similar, using fluid pressure to break apart rock formations. But hydraulic fracturing targets specific underground layers, while ruina montium targeted entire mountains. The scale was massive, the violence spectacular, the engineering remarkable. Then Rome fell, and the knowledge vanished. Medieval mining returned to hand digging, following ore veins with picks and hammers. Early modern mining used fire setting, heating rock, then dousing it with water to cause cracking. Primitive techniques that made slow progress and frequently killed miners. Hydraulic mining wasn't reinvented until the 1850s during the California gold rush. American miners, desperate and innovative, began using high-pressure water jets to wash away hillsides. It worked spectacularly, moving earth far faster than manual labor could. But they didn't understand erosion dynamics the way Romans apparently had. The California operations caused massive environmental damage, filling rivers with sediment, destroying salmon runs, flooding farmland with mining debris. The devastation got so bad that hydraulic mining was eventually banned in much of California. The court cases, the environmental regulations, the restrictions, all because 19th century miners rediscovered a technique, but not the knowledge that made it controllable. Romans had used the same basic technology for centuries without destroying entire watersheds. They managed the environmental impacts somehow, controlled the erosion, directed the water and sediment in ways that didn't wreck everything downstream. That knowledge, how to use water as industrial-scale mining tool without causing ecological catastrophe, was lost completely. The landscape at Las Medulas remains testament to what they could do, a monument to engineering ambition and technical capability that literally moved mountains, then disappeared from human knowledge for 1.5 millennia. Water wasn't just a tool for construction and mining. Romans understood that clean water meant healthy populations, and they built systems to remove waste and disease that we wouldn't match for nearly 2,000 years. What they knew about sanitation died with them, and millions paid the price. Walk through the ruins of Ephesus on Turkey's coast, and you'll find the public latrines near the Library of Celsus. Marble seating arranged in rows. Channels beneath where water flowed constantly, carrying waste away. Not a bathroom in the modern sense. More of a social space where Romans conducted business and conversation while attending to bodily necessities. The modern visitor reaction is usually amusement. Look how differently they thought about privacy. How peculiar that they chatted while defecating. But that misses what's remarkable here. The engineering. The understanding of what running water could accomplish for public health. Roman sewers used continuous water flow to flush waste away from population centers. The principle was simple, but the implementation sophisticated. Water from aqueducts was diverted through public latrines and baths, picking up waste, carrying it through underground channels to rivers or the sea. Waste never accumulated. Disease-carrying material never built up in streets or living areas. The Cloaca Maxima in Rome, the Great Sewer, was built in the 6th century BCE and still functions today. For 2,600 years, it's been doing its job, removing waste from the city. The Romans understood early that waste disposal was critical to urban life. Cities generate sewage. Let it accumulate and people die. Move it away efficiently, and populations stay healthier. The public health implications were massive. Roman cities with proper sanitation had significantly lower mortality rates than medieval European cities. When Roman infrastructure decayed after the empire's fall, European cities lost their sewer systems and went back to dumping waste wherever was convenient, in streets, in rivers that also supplied drinking water, in pits that leaked into groundwater. The result was predictable and horrific. Typhoid, cholera, dysentery, diseases that thrive in contaminated water became endemic. Medieval cities were death traps, particularly for children. Mortality rates that would be unthinkable today were just accepted reality for centuries. London, one of the world's great cities, didn't build a comprehensive sewer system until the 1860s, after a cholera epidemic killed thousands, and the Thames became so polluted that Parliament couldn't meet because of the stench. This was roughly 1,500 years after Rome had standardized such systems across its empire. Romans didn't understand germ theory, wouldn't for another millennium and a half, but they observed empirically that moving waste away from people reduced disease. They saw that cities with better sanitation had healthier populations. They didn't need to understand why it worked to build systems that worked consistently. That observational wisdom was lost when the infrastructure collapsed. Medieval physicians blamed disease on bad air, on imbalanced humors, on divine punishment. They didn't connect contaminated water to cholera, human waste in streets to typhoid. The knowledge that Romans had gained through observation and retained through infrastructure maintenance simply evaporated when the system stopped functioning. Roman public baths served similar purpose, not just cleanliness, but disease prevention. Regular bathing reduces skin infections, removes parasites, prevents conditions that thrive on unwashed bodies. The baths were heated by sophisticated hypocaust systems, underfloor heating that circulated hot air beneath the floors and up through wall cavities. Maintaining body cleanliness was public policy, subsidized by the state, available to all citizens. Medieval Europe, particularly Northern Europe, largely abandoned regular bathing. Partly cultural shift, partly because the infrastructure no longer existed. Heating massive bath complexes required aqueducts to supply water and sophisticated furnaces to generate heat. When those systems fell apart, public bathing ended. People went back to occasional washing, if that. The human cost can be calculated. Conservative estimates suggest millions of excess deaths from preventable diseases during the medieval period. Deaths that wouldn't have occurred if Roman sanitation engineering had been maintained, or if the knowledge had survived to be re-implemented. This wasn't abstract loss of technical information. This was loss of practical knowledge that kept people alive. Every child who died of typhoid from contaminated water, every family devastated by cholera, every epidemic that swept through unsanitary medieval cities. These were consequences of forgotten engineering. Romans had solved problems that medieval Europe didn't even recognize as solvable. They built infrastructure that prevented disease on civilizational scale. Then that knowledge died. And for 15 centuries, European cities were objectively less healthy than they'd been under Roman rule. The technology existed. The principles were sound, but without institutional continuity to maintain systems and train new engineers, even successful solutions can be completely lost, taking countless lives with them. While hydraulic engineering and sanitation saved lives, Roman medicine was doing something equally remarkable. Performing surgeries with instruments that looked disturbingly modern. And then those instruments, and the knowledge behind them, vanished. August 24th, 79 CE. Vesuvius erupts. The city of Pompeii dies in hours, buried under volcanic ash and pumice. Everything stops in an instant. Meals half-eaten on tables, people frozen in their final moments. And in one particular house near the city's amphitheatre, a collection of instruments left exactly where their owner placed them, preserved perfectly under 20 feet of volcanic debris. Archaeologists call it the House of the Surgeon. When they excavated it in the 1800s, they found over 40 surgical instruments. Not crude tools or primitive approximations, refined medical instruments that looked disturbingly familiar. Scalpels with blade angles identical to modern surgical scalpels. The edge geometry, the handle design, the balance, all the same. Forceps with the same mechanical principle, the same pivot point, the same gripping surfaces we use today. Bone saws with tooth patterns that modern orthopedic surgeons would recognize instantly. Vaginal speculums that gynecologists still use in effectively the same design. Catheters, bone drills. A specialized probe that appears designed specifically for cataract surgery. Hold a Roman scalpel next to a modern one and you'd struggle to explain the differences. The materials are different. Bronze versus stainless steel. The manufacturing is different. Forged versus precision machined. But the design, the function, the understanding of what makes an effective surgical tool, identical across 2,000 years. This wasn't one physician's unique collection. Similar instruments have been found at Roman sites across the empire. Standardized designs, consistent quality, widespread distribution. This was industrial production of medical equipment, suggesting organized medical education with agreed-upon best practices. The instruments tell us Romans were performing surgery. What they don't tell us is how sophisticated that surgery was. For that, we look at the texts, specifically the work of Galen of Pergamon, Rome's most famous physician. Galen performed brain surgery. Not just trepanation, which other ancient cultures did, but deliberate surgical interventions targeting specific conditions. He removed cataracts, restoring sight to the blind. He describes cesarean sections in his texts, including guidance on when the procedure was appropriate and techniques to improve maternal survival. His anatomical knowledge was extraordinary for any era, let alone the 2nd century. He understood that arteries carried blood, not air, disproving theories that had persisted for centuries. He identified 7 of the 12 cranial nerves. He recognized that the brain, not the heart, controlled the body, a concept that seems obvious now but was revolutionary then. He understood kidney function, that these organs filtered blood and produced urine. He even grasped that heart valves maintained one-way blood flow, getting remarkably close to understanding circulation 14 centuries before William Harvey. But here's what histories often miss. Galen wasn't a lone genius working in isolation. He was the peak of a medical tradition stretching back centuries. Roman military doctors, treating battlefield injuries, accumulated vast practical knowledge. Greek physicians contributed theoretical frameworks and observational methods. Egyptian medical texts, thousands of years old, informed Roman practice. Galen served as physician to gladiators early in his career. That meant treating traumatic injuries daily. Deep wounds, shattered bones, organs exposed. The human body laid bare, not through careful dissection, but through violence. He learned anatomy from necessity, from seeing what worked and what didn't, from patients who lived and patients who died. When Rome fell, Galen's texts survived. Barely. A few manuscripts, copied and recopied, transmitted through Arabic translations during the Islamic Golden Age, eventually returning to Europe. But the system that created physicians like Galen, that collapsed completely. Medical schools closed. Dissection practices were banned by medieval Christian authorities who considered the body sacred and inviolable. The empirical tradition, learning through observation, testing, refinement, was replaced by scholasticism, where ancient texts were memorized and debated, but rarely tested against reality. The instruments buried in Pompeii represented something larger than tools. They represented an entire medical culture, training systems, knowledge transmission, social acceptance of surgery as legitimate healing rather than butchery. When that culture collapsed, the instruments became artifacts, interesting relics from a civilization that had somehow known things medieval physicians couldn't imagine. But instruments are just tools. What's truly remarkable is what Roman surgeons did with those tools. Procedures that we're told didn't exist until modern medicine. Yet the evidence says otherwise. Cataract surgery sounds modern. The idea of deliberately inserting an instrument into the eye, manipulating the lens, restoring sight. It feels like something from the last century, maybe two. Something requiring microscopes, anesthesia, sterile operating rooms. Romans were doing it 2,000 years ago. The technique was called couching. A needle-like instrument, bronze and precisely shaped, would be inserted through the white of the eye. The surgeon would push the clouded lens downward and out of the visual axis. Not removing it, that came later with more advanced techniques, but displacing it so light could reach the retina again. The patient, who had been living in progressive darkness, could see. Archaeological evidence from Montpellier shows a Roman-era bronze needle designed specifically for this procedure. The tip is carefully calibrated, the shaft rigid enough to manipulate the lens but not so thick it causes excessive trauma. This wasn't experimental. This was refined, standardized equipment for a routine procedure. Medieval Europe eventually rediscovered couching, but not commonly until the 1700s. 15 centuries between Roman ophthalmology and its re-emergence. 15 centuries of blind people who might have been helped, living in darkness because the knowledge was lost. Trepanation, drilling holes in skulls, appears in multiple ancient cultures, but Roman physicians refined it beyond crude boring. They understood that head injuries could cause bleeding inside the skull, creating pressure that killed patients. Relieving that pressure required accessing the brain, which meant penetrating bone without destroying the delicate tissue beneath. Roman trepanation tools created clean, circular holes, specialized drills with stops to prevent penetrating too deeply, techniques for avoiding major blood vessels. Most remarkably, they understood sterile procedure, boiling instruments before use, using wine as an antiseptic. The alcohol killed bacteria they couldn't see, but had learned empirically caused infection. We know patients survived because we have skulls showing healed trepanation sites. Clean bone regrowth around the margins, indicating the person lived weeks, months, sometimes years after the procedure. This wasn't desperate last resort butchery with predictably fatal results. This was surgery with survival rates that suggest genuine medical competence. Then there's caesarean section. The etymology is disputed, maybe from Julius Caesar's birth, maybe from the Latin verb to cut. What's not disputed is that Roman medical texts describe the procedure, when to perform it, how to minimize blood loss, techniques to improve maternal survival, though admittedly survival rates were lower than modern medicine achieves. Medieval European physicians largely abandoned surgical childbirth intervention. Prayer became the primary response to complicated births. When surgical delivery was attempted, it was usually to save the child from a mother already dead or dying. The concept of performing caesarean section to save both mother and child, something Roman texts discuss, was lost. Maternal mortality rates skyrocketed. Complications that Roman physicians might have addressed surgically became death sentences. Women died. Babies died. Families were destroyed by conditions that weren't necessarily fatal, but had become so, because knowledge had been forgotten. Why did these techniques vanish? Surgery requires more than knowing the steps. It requires institutional support. medical schools where techniques are taught systematically, libraries preserving texts, legal and social permission to cut into bodies, cultural acceptance that surgery is legitimate medicine, not mutilation. The medieval church's position that the body was sacred and shouldn't be violated created enormous barriers. Human dissection was forbidden or severely restricted. Without dissection, anatomy remained abstract. Without understanding anatomy, surgery stayed primitive or was abandoned entirely. Roman medical schools collapsed along with everything else. The formal training system that produced Galen and thousands of less famous physicians ceased to exist. Knowledge reverted to individual healers working in isolation, herbalists, bone setters, midwives. Some possessed genuine skill, but without institutional frameworks to accumulate and transmit complex knowledge, sophisticated techniques couldn't survive. Medieval universities eventually revived medical education, but slowly. And when they did, dissection was rare. Texts were memorized but not tested. Galen's works were treated as infallible scripture rather than as methodology to emulate. Students learned what Galen said, not how Galen learned. So techniques that had been routine in Roman practice became lost arts. Procedures that had saved lives for centuries were forgotten. The instruments existed. Archaeologists kept finding them. But the knowledge of what to do with them, the surgical skill, the institutional training, the cultural permission, all gone. Medieval Europe called these procedures impossible or branded them as witchcraft. Not because they actually were impossible, but because the knowledge to perform them had died. And with it died countless people who might have been saved. Surgical skill was impressive, but it's what Roman physicians understood about the human body itself that seems truly impossible for their time. Some of their anatomical knowledge wouldn't be rediscovered until the Renaissance, and some of it still puzzles medical historians today. Galen understood circulation, not completely. William Harvey wouldn't figure out the full circulatory system until 1628, 14 centuries later. But Galen knew that arteries and veins were separate systems. He recognized that blood flowed, that it moved through the body in organized patterns. He understood that heart valves maintained one-way flow, preventing backflow. He was remarkably close to grasping the complete picture. He knew nerves transmitted signals from the brain, not electrical impulses. That concept waited another 1600 years. But he understood the brain controlled the body, that damage to specific nerves caused specific losses of function. He'd mapped 7 of the 12 cranial nerves, documenting which controlled which facial movements, which carried sensation from which areas. He understood kidney function, that these organs filtered blood, concentrating waste into urine. Not the detailed mechanism of nephron filtration, but the functional principle. Blood goes in, cleaned blood comes out, waste is eliminated. This shouldn't have been possible. Human anatomy is hidden inside bodies. You can't see it functioning. Studying it requires dissection, systematic exploration, careful documentation. Galen had all 3. He'd served as physician to gladiators in Pergamon, battlefield medicine before battlefields were called that. Men with their bodies torn open, organs visible, bones shattered. Every injury was an anatomy lesson. which wounds were fatal, which survivable. What each organ did became apparent when damage to it killed or crippled. Knowledge earned through tragedy, but knowledge nonetheless. He performed public dissections, usually animals, sometimes human cadavers when available. He demonstrated anatomy to students and colleagues, showing structures, explaining functions, testing theories. Cut this nerve, and the arm goes limp. Damage this part of the brain and speech fails. Empirical observation, methodical documentation. He was part of a tradition valuing evidence over philosophy. Greek medicine had spent centuries debating what the body must be like based on logic and theory. Galen's approach was different. Cut open and look. See what's actually there. Test your ideas against reality. When Rome fell, his texts survived, partially, copied by hand in monasteries, translated into Arabic during the Islamic Golden Age, eventually retranslated back into Latin. We have much of Galen's work. What we lost was the methodology, the tradition, the institutional framework that created physicians like him. Medieval European scholars treated Galen as infallible authority. They memorized his conclusions. Arteries carry blood. Nerves transmit signals. Kidneys filter. But they didn't emulate his process. They didn't dissect and observe and question. Galen said it. Therefore it was true. No need to verify. When medical schools gradually revived in medieval universities, dissection was rare and heavily restricted. Maybe one dissection per year, performed ceremonially, with a professor reading Galen's texts while a barber surgeon did the cutting. Students barely saw the body, never touched it, learned anatomy from books rather than observation. Andreas Vesalius in the 1540s is celebrated for correcting some of Galen's errors, showing that human anatomy differed in some ways from the animal anatomy Galen had studied. But read Vesalius carefully, and you realize he wasn't just correcting mistakes. He was rediscovering method. Dissection as learning tool. Observation as authority. Testing classical texts against physical reality. We estimate Roman anatomical understanding, at least Galen's understanding, was roughly equivalent to 16th or 17th century European knowledge. Europe lost somewhere between 1200 and 1400 years of medical progress. More than a millennium during which physicians knew less about the human body than Galen had in the 2nd century. The human cost defies calculation. How many died from conditions Romans could have diagnosed? How many suffered complications that Roman anatomical knowledge might have prevented? How many surgical interventions failed because medieval physicians didn't understand what they were cutting through? Millions. Conservative estimates say millions of preventable deaths over those lost centuries. And some texts didn't survive at all. We have references to works that are gone completely. Galen mentions other physicians, other texts, other discoveries. Those are lost. We don't even know what we don't know. What knowledge disappeared so thoroughly that not even references remain? A Roman physician in 200 CE understood circulation, nerve function, kidney filtration. European doctors in 1400 CE still thought blood was made in the liver and consumed by tissues. They'd regressed. Knowledge had actually moved backward. Medicine wasn't the only field where Roman theoretical understanding seems impossibly advanced. When we look at their astronomy and mathematics, we find calculations and concepts that wouldn't resurface in Europe for over 1,000 years, and some that still raise questions today. There's a puzzle at the heart of Roman engineering that nobody likes to discuss. The Pantheon's dome required calculating volumes, weights, structural loads distributed across a curved surface. Aqueduct surveys spanning hundreds of kilometers needed trigonometry and understanding of Earth's curvature. Distributing grain rations to 1 million people demanded accurate accounting and logistics planning. All of this required mathematics. Sophisticated mathematics. The kind that makes modern engineers reach for calculators. Romans used numerals that make basic arithmetic a nightmare. Try multiplying XLIV by XD3 using Roman numerals. Just try. You can't do it efficiently. The system isn't designed for calculation. It's designed for recording results. Addition is tedious. Multiplication is nearly impossible. Division and fractions become absurd. Yet somehow Romans built structures that required precise mathematical modeling. They surveyed routes that needed geometric solutions we'd use calculus to solve. They managed logistics that demanded computational power their numeric system couldn't provide. The answer is, they didn't calculate the way we do. They used different tools, different methods, different mathematical thinking entirely. For accounting and basic arithmetic, they used the abacus. Not the children's toy version, but sophisticated counting boards with beads or stones representing different values. A skilled abacus user could add, subtract, multiply, and divide faster than someone working with written Roman numerals. The calculation happened physically, with the hands, the results recorded afterward. No written arithmetic required. For structural engineering, they used physical models and proportional scaling. Build a small version, test it, scale up the proportions. Greek mathematical texts provided theoretical backing, but Roman engineers worked empirically. They understood that doubling dimensions didn't just double strength. It changed everything about how structures behaved. They learned this through observation and testing, not through abstract equations. For surveying, they had instruments that solved problems mechanically. The Groma established perfect right angles through hanging weights and sightlines. The Corobots leveled across long distances using water channels. These weren't measurement tools requiring calculation afterward. They were mathematical solutions embodied in physical form. The instrument did the geometry. The engineer just had to use it correctly. This represents fundamentally different mathematical thinking, not abstract and symbolic, but practical, visual, tactile. The mathematics was embedded in tools, techniques, traditional proportions. Knowledge passed through demonstration rather than textbooks. Understanding that lived in hands and eyes rather than written formulas. When Roman civilization collapsed, this practical mathematical culture vanished. Medieval Europe retained some theoretical mathematics through translated Greek texts, Euclid's geometry, basic arithmetic principles. But the engineering mathematics, the applied knowledge that let Romans build impossibly ambitious structures, that died with the civilization that created it. Gothic cathedral architects spent generations rediscovering structural principles through trial and error. Towers collapsed, vaults cracked. Entire projects failed because the builders were working without the accumulated engineering knowledge Romans had possessed. What Romans knew intuitively from training and tradition, medieval builders had to relearn through expensive, sometimes deadly experimentation. The Colosseum was built in under 8 years, a massive, complex structure with sophisticated crowd management, underground machinery, precise structural calculations. 8 years from start to completion. Medieval cathedrals took centuries. Notre Dame took nearly 200 years. Cologne Cathedral took over 600 years. The difference wasn't just ambition or resources, it was knowledge. Romans possessed engineering mathematics that let them work efficiently, confidently. Medieval builders were feeling their way forward in darkness, rediscovering principles that had once been standard practice. Some evidence of Roman mathematical sophistication survives. Surveying manuals contain geometric solutions, showing they understood concepts we'd later formalize algebraically. Architecture displays proportional relationships and load calculations that imply sophisticated modeling. The Antikythera mechanism, technically Greek but within Roman cultural sphere, proves they could design gear systems encoding complex astronomical ratios. But these are fragments. The comprehensive mathematical education that produced engineers capable of building the Pantheon, that training system and knowledge tradition, is gone. We have the monuments. We can measure them, analyze them, reverse engineer their principles. What we can't fully recover is the mathematical thinking that created them, that fundamentally different approach to calculation and problem solving that worked without the symbolic mathematics we consider essential. The structures themselves are mathematical treatises, written in stone and concrete rather than symbols. We can read them, but we're reading a language we only partially understand. From a mathematical culture that approached numbers differently than we do. Mathematics was just one area where Roman theoretical knowledge exceeded what we'd expect. When we look at their understanding of astronomy, the movements of planets, the calculation of eclipses, the size of the Earth, we find knowledge that makes us question what else they knew. Eratosthenes stood in Alexandria and watched shadows. Specifically, he watched the shadow cast by a vertical stick at precisely noon on the summer solstice. The shadow was short, but measurable. He noted the angle, about 7 degrees from vertical. On the same day, at the same time, 5,000 stadia to the south in Siena, no shadow appeared. The sun was directly overhead, its light falling straight down wells. Vertical objects casting no shadow at all. 2 cities. 2 shadows. One simple observation. From this, Eratosthenes calculated Earth's circumference. His result was within 2% of the actual value. In the 3rd century BCE, using only shadows and geometry. The calculation required understanding several things. First, that Earth was spherical, not flat. Second, that the sun was far enough away that its rays arrived essentially parallel. Third, basic geometry relating angles to arc length. He had all 3. He treated Earth as a sphere, the distance between cities as an arc along that sphere, and the shadow angle as proportional to the total circumference. It worked. Brilliantly. And this knowledge wasn't obscure or secret. Educated Romans knew Earth was round. They knew its approximate size. They understood the geometric principles. This was standard intellectual currency in the Roman world. Medieval Europe forgot, or disputed, or simply didn't care. Flat Earth beliefs resurged, not universally. Some scholars maintained the truth, but the knowledge became controversial rather than settled fact. It took navigators in the age of exploration, sailing around continents and coming back where they started, to empirically confirm what Romans had known mathematically 15 centuries earlier. Hipparchus created a star catalogue with over 850 stars, each positioned precisely. More remarkably, he discovered axial precession, the slow wobble in Earth's axis that takes 26,000 years to complete one cycle. Detecting this required comparing observations separated by generations, recognizing that star positions had shifted slightly over centuries. This wasn't just astronomical observation. This was detecting a phenomenon so gradual that no single human lifetime could observe it directly. Ptolemy's Almagest, written in Roman Egypt, provided mathematical models of planetary motion, accurate enough to predict eclipses years in advance. The calculations were complex: epicycles and deferents, geometric constructions that approximated planetary paths. Wrong theory, ultimately, but producing correct predictions. Navigation used these tables. Agricultural calendars depended on them. Rome's calendar itself demonstrated astronomical sophistication. Julius Caesar reformed the calendar with help from Egyptian astronomers, creating the Julian calendar in 46 BCE. It assumed a year of 365.25 days, requiring one leap year every 4 years. This was accurate enough to remain Rome's standard calendar, and after Rome fell, Europe's standard until 1582. 16 centuries of use with only minor correction needed. The Gregorian calendar we use today is just the Julian calendar with a small adjustment, skipping 3 leap years every 400 years to account for the year being slightly shorter than 365.25 days. But beyond practical astronomy, there was theoretical speculation that sounds shockingly modern. Aristarchus of Samos, 3rd century BCE, proposed heliocentrism. The sun at the center, Earth and planets orbiting it. This was 18 centuries before Copernicus. The model was rejected. Ptolemy's geocentric system made better predictions with available observations. But the point is, someone conceived it. Someone looked at the cosmos and thought, what if we're not at the center? This knowledge required infrastructure, observatories for systematic observation, libraries preserving data across generations, mathematical training to model celestial mechanics, institutional continuity supporting long-term projects. When Roman educational infrastructure collapsed, sophisticated astronomy largely vanished from Western Europe. It survived elsewhere. The Islamic Golden Age preserved Roman and Greek astronomical knowledge, improved on it, developed new instruments and techniques. Islamic astronomers kept the tradition alive, while European astronomy regressed to basic calendrical calculations and astrological speculation. Europe eventually recovered this knowledge through Arabic texts, translated in the 12th and 13th centuries, but that represented centuries of lost progress. Time when European astronomy was less sophisticated than what Romans had practiced 1,000 years earlier. The pattern repeats. Knowledge accumulated over centuries, preserved through institutions, requiring continuous cultivation and transmission. When institutions collapse, knowledge scatters. Some survives in texts, some survives in other cultures. much simply dies, waiting to be painstakingly rediscovered. Romans knew Earth was round. They'd calculated its size accurately. They'd mapped the stars precisely. Some had even proposed heliocentrism. Medieval Europe forgot all three, or disputed them, or lost the mathematical sophistication to engage with them meaningfully. Astronomical calculations required instruments, tools for measuring angles, tracking time, recording observations. Some of those instruments are so sophisticated they've been called ancient computers. And the most famous one still doesn't make sense. In 1901, sponge divers working off the Greek island of Antikythera found a shipwreck. Roman era, maybe 1st century BCE, bronze statues, pottery, the usual archaeological treasures, and one corroded lump that nobody understood. It sat in storage for decades. Just a mass of calcified bronze, vaguely mechanical looking, but unimpressive. Then someone X-rayed it. The images showed gears, dozens of gears, interlocking, carefully sized, precisely positioned. This wasn't decoration. This was a machine. Further analysis revealed at least 30 bronze gears arranged in a sophisticated mechanism. The gear teeth are triangular, interlocking smoothly. The ratios between gears encode specific mathematical relationships. One gear ratio is 254 to 19, which happens to approximate the relationship between solar years and lunar months with remarkable accuracy. Modern reconstructions, built using the original as template, demonstrate what this machine did. It calculated astronomical positions. Turn a crank and the gears rotate, showing the sun's position through the zodiac, the moon's phase and position, the positions of the 5 planets known to ancient astronomers. It predicted eclipses using the Saros cycle, a 223-month period, after which eclipse patterns repeat. It was, functionally, an analog computer for astronomy. The engineering shouldn't be possible. Creating gears this precise required sophisticated metalworking, lathes or similar tools capable of cutting uniform teeth. Understanding how to calculate gear ratios to produce desired outputs requires mathematical sophistication. The device as a whole demonstrates knowledge of mechanics and astronomy that seems impossibly advanced. It dates to around 100 BCE, 1st century before Christ, and we see nothing like it anywhere else in the ancient world. No known predecessors showing simpler versions being developed and refined. No known successors carrying the technology forward. The Antikythera mechanism stands alone, technologically isolated. The next devices with comparable complexity are Islamic astronomical clocks from the medieval period and European mechanical clocks from the 14th century. That's a gap of 1400 years. 14 centuries where nothing remotely similar appears in the archaeological or historical record. Several theories attempt to explain this. Maybe it was a unique masterpiece by a genius inventor, one-of-a-kind brilliance that died with its creator. Possible, but the sophistication suggests institutional knowledge, not solitary genius. Building this required skills in metalworking, astronomy, mathematics, mechanics. That's collaborative work, not one person laboring in isolation. Maybe there was a broader tradition of gear-based mechanisms that didn't survive. Bronze was valuable. When devices broke or became obsolete, they'd be melted down for the metal. We might be seeing the single lucky survivor from a whole category of machines that were all recycled for their material value. The Antikythera mechanism only survived because it was shipwrecked and buried, protected from salvage. Recent scholarship suggests it might have been built on Rhodes, possibly by followers of Hipparchus, the astronomer who catalogued stars and discovered axial precession. That would explain the astronomical sophistication and implies an institutional tradition, a school, essentially, producing astronomical instruments. But if such a tradition existed, why no mentions in surviving texts? Greek and Roman writers documented all sorts of technological marvels: automated theatres, pneumatic devices, water organs. Why no descriptions of these astronomical computers? Why no instruction manuals? No theoretical treatises? No casual references? The silence is as mysterious as the device itself. Either it was so rare and restricted that nobody wrote about it, or those writings were lost, or it was more common but considered too mundane to document, or some other explanation we haven't considered. Modern scientists have studied the Antikythera mechanism extensively. X-rays, CT scans, detailed reconstructions. We understand what it does. We can build working replicas. What we don't fully understand is how it fits into ancient technological development. What came before it? What came after? Was this the peak of a long tradition or a strange aberration? It represents ancient technological capability reaching levels we associate with much later periods. Proof that the ancient world could achieve sophistication we've systematically underestimated. Every assumption about what they could or couldn't do requires recalibration when confronted with 30 bronze gears calculating eclipses 2,000 years ago. The Antikythera mechanism shows that ancient technology could reach levels we associate with much later periods. But perhaps the most unsettling lost technology isn't what Romans created. It's what they destroyed. Specifically, a weapon so terrifying it was used only in desperate moments and then deliberately forgotten. 678. Constantinople's walls face their greatest test. Arab fleets fill the Bosporus. Siege engines positioned. Assault imminent. The Eastern Roman Empire, what we call Byzantine, teeters on collapse. Then the defenders unveil something new. Byzantine ships emerge from the harbour, not to ram or board, just to position themselves near the enemy fleet. Then the siphons activate. Liquid fire shoots across the water, igniting enemy vessels on contact. The flames spread impossibly fast. Sailors throw water on the fires. The fires burn hotter. Men leap overboard to escape the heat. The flames follow them into the water, burning on the surface, turning the sea itself into an inferno. Within hours, entire sections of the Arab fleet are destroyed, not sunk through conventional combat, incinerated by a weapon that defied every expectation about how fire should behave. This was Greek fire, and its formula became one of history's most closely guarded secrets. Technically, this is Byzantine technology, not classical Roman. But Byzantium was the Eastern Roman Empire's continuation, heir to Roman engineering traditions and chemical knowledge. Greek fire represents the endpoint of centuries of Roman military innovation, the final, terrifying application of their understanding of combustion and chemistry. What we know about Greek fire comes from descriptions, not formulas. It was a liquid incendiary launched from siphons mounted on ships, essentially flamethrowers before the term existed. It burned on water, which shouldn't be possible with ordinary fire. It stuck to surfaces like napalm. Water couldn't extinguish it. Attempting to do so made it burn more intensely. Only specific substances worked: vinegar, sand, urine. Even then, suppression was difficult. The psychological impact was devastating. Sailors who'd faced arrows, rams, boarding parties, and conventional fire weapons would break and flee at the sight of Greek fire. Some enemy crews reportedly refused to engage Byzantine ships entirely, knowing what awaited them. Fear became as effective as the weapon itself. The formula was state secret at the highest level. Only the emperor and a select group of chemists knew the complete recipe. It wasn't written down, couldn't risk capture or theft. Knowledge passed through direct instruction, master to apprentice, each generation teaching the next through demonstration and supervised preparation. This security worked perfectly. Too perfectly. When the Byzantine Empire declined and the need for Greek fire diminished, when the last chemists who knew the formula died without fully training successors, the knowledge died with them. By the time anyone thought to record it properly, nobody remembered exactly how it was made. Modern chemists have theories, likely petroleum-based. Constantinople had access to natural oil seeps in the region, possibly thickened with resins to make it sticky. Sulfur for fuel. Maybe quicklime, which reacts violently with water, explaining why water made it burn hotter. Saltpeter might have been involved, though that's debated. Mix them in the right proportions, under the right conditions, and you get something close to what descriptions suggest. Close, not exact. Modern reconstructions produce incendiary substances with similar properties. They burn on water. They're difficult to extinguish. But we can't confirm whether they match the original Greek fire exactly. Some properties described in historical accounts remain difficult to replicate. The chemistry required was sophisticated, understanding combustion well enough to create controlled, stable mixtures that ignited on command, engineering delivery systems that could project liquid fire without exploding prematurely, calculating fuel-to-oxidizer ratios, managing heat and pressure. This wasn't accidental discovery. This was chemical warfare. After Greek fire was lost, no European military power possessed comparable weapons for centuries. Not until the 20th century's development of napalm and modern military flamethrowers did similar incendiary weapons re-emerge. Nearly 800 years without anything matching Greek fire's capabilities. For 500 years, this single weapon gave Byzantium military superiority that kept the empire alive. When the formula was lost, the balance of power shifted. One piece of chemical knowledge, one formula that died with its last keeper, changed Mediterranean geopolitics. It's a stark reminder. Sometimes losing a single technology can alter the course of history. And sometimes, perhaps, it's better that way. Some knowledge is dangerous enough that its loss might not be entirely tragic. Greek fire is the most famous lost Roman weapon, but it wasn't the only one. Roman military engineering included technologies that gave legions advantages historians still argue about, and some that sound too advanced to be real. The ballista looks like an oversized crossbow, but the comparison misleads. A crossbow stores energy in a bent limb. A ballista stores it in torsion springs, bundles of sinew or hair twisted tight, then twisted tighter still. Release the mechanism, and the stored rotational energy converts to linear force, launching bolts with enough power to punch through shields, armor, men. Building functional torsion springs requires understanding material properties. Which animal sinews provide optimal elasticity? How tightly to twist before the material fails? How weather affects performance? Sinew behaves differently when wet. Roman engineers calculated trajectories, adjusted for wind and range, operated these weapons with precision that transformed them from crude catapults into artillery. The onager threw stones instead of bolts, using similar torsion principles. Both weapons gave legions range striking power that could break formations before infantry engaged, combined arms warfare before the term existed. But the real engineering marvel was speed. A full Roman legion, 5,000 plus men, could construct a fortified marching camp in under 5 hours, not a temporary bivouac, a proper fortress with ditches, palisade walls, organized internal streets, designated areas for each unit. This was possible through standardization. Every Roman camp followed the same layout. Every soldier knew exactly where his unit's section would be, where the command tent stood, where supplies would be stored. No confusion, no wasted time deciding arrangements. Just rapid, efficient execution of a plan every man had memorized through training and repetition. Components were prefabricated or quickly assembled. Wooden stakes for palisades carried by soldiers on march. Surveying instruments marking corners and boundaries with mechanical precision. Officers directing work crews with practiced efficiency. The result? By nightfall, a legion had a defensible position that would take days to assault. Medieval armies forgot this capability entirely. They might build crude defensive positions given time and necessity, but the rapid, standardized construction that made Roman camps simultaneously temporary and formidable, that knowledge vanished. Medieval military encampments were disorganized affairs, vulnerable to surprise attack, reflecting the absence of systematic engineering thinking. Roman personal equipment reflected similar engineering sophistication. The gladius, short sword designed specifically for stabbing in close formation. Longer slashing weapons required space to swing, making them ineffective in tight shield walls. The gladius worked in confined spaces, delivering lethal thrusts from behind shield protection. Design matched tactical doctrine precisely. The scutum shield was laminated wood construction, not solid. Layers glued together provided strength-to-weight ratios solid wood couldn't match. Lighter shields meant less fatigue over long battles. The metal boss in the center could be used offensively, punching into enemy formations, creating openings for gladius thrusts. Armor evolved through bronze, iron, and eventually steel iterations, each balancing protection against mobility. Too heavy, and soldiers couldn't march long distances or fight effectively. Too light, and they died. Roman metallurgy found optimal compromises, producing armor that kept soldiers alive without crippling their endurance. But individual equipment, impressive as it was, mattered less than systems integration. Roman legions functioned as combined arms forces. Infantry formed the core. Cavalry provided mobility and flanking capability. Artillery broke enemy formations before engagement. Engineers built bridges, siege works, fortifications. Medical staff treated wounded. Supply trains maintained logistics. Communication systems coordinated everything through standards, signals, and command structure. This was military science. Warfare approached as engineering problem-solving rather than ritualized combat. Need to cross a river? Build a bridge. Enemy has fortified position? Construct siege works. Outnumbered? Use superior organization and coordination to create local advantages. Romans systematized warfare in ways that wouldn't fully re-emerge until professional standing armies developed in early modern Europe. Medieval warfare regressed toward individualistic combat. Knights focused on personal prowess. Feudal levies lacked systematic training. Castle sieges often became protracted waits for starvation, rather than engineered assault. The concept of warfare as integrated engineering, combining multiple technologies into coherent operational systems, was lost and had to be painstakingly rebuilt. Modern military historians study Roman logistics and organization as exemplars of efficiency. The principles Romans established, standardization, systematic training, combined arms integration, engineering focus, are considered fundamental to military effectiveness even today. We didn't invent these concepts. We rediscovered them after centuries of forgetting. The legion's engineering arsenal wasn't just weapons. It was systematic thinking about violence, organization elevated to science, knowledge that transformed warfare then disappeared, leaving medieval armies to relearn basic principles Romans had mastered and lost. But Roman military superiority wasn't just about weapons and fortifications. It was about infrastructure, roads that let armies move faster than any enemy, supply chains that stretched across continents, and communication networks that coordinated vast territories. When that infrastructure collapsed, empires became impossible to maintain. At its peak, the Roman road network exceeded 250,000 miles, more extensive than the modern United States interstate highway system. Roads connecting Britain to Syria, North Africa to the Rhine frontier, creating an integrated transportation network spanning the known world. These weren't dirt paths worn by foot traffic. They were engineered structures built in layers. Large foundation stones, providing stable base. Smaller stones and gravel creating drainage. Sand for leveling. Fitted paving stones on top, sometimes carved to interlock, creating surfaces that could handle heavy traffic for centuries. Roman roads were cambered, higher in the middle than the edges, so water shed off rather than pooling. Drainage ditches flanked both sides, carrying runoff away from the roadbed. The engineering prevented erosion and water damage that destroyed lesser roads within years. Many Roman roads remain in use today. 2,000 years later, modern traffic, modern vehicles, driving on foundations laid before the fall of the Western Empire. That's not preservation or careful maintenance. That's original engineering still performing its function across 2 millennia. The strategic purpose was military. Roman roads allowed legions to march 25 to 30 miles per day, faster than typical ancient armies managed. This mobility meant Rome could respond to threats quickly, moving reinforcements before enemies expected them, supplying armies deep in hostile territory through reliable logistics networks. But the military application was just the beginning. The roads enabled the cursus publicus, Rome's state-run courier service. Messages could travel the length of the empire in days. Imperial edicts issued in Rome would reach Britain or Egypt faster than seemed possible. Governors communicated with the capital. Military commanders coordinated operations. Intelligence flowed continuously. This communication speed wouldn't be matched again until the telegraph in the 19th century. 1800 years later. For all the medieval period and early modern era, long-distance communication was slower than what Rome had achieved and then lost. Economic impacts were equally profound. Roman roads facilitated trade across vast distances. British tin reached Mediterranean markets. Eastern spices flowed west to Atlantic ports. Egyptian grain supplied Rome. Spanish silver funded legions. Integrated markets emerged because goods could move reliably, predictably, rapidly. When the roads fell into disrepair after Rome's collapse, long-distance trade declined sharply, not because demand disappeared, but because transportation became unreliable and dangerous. Poorly maintained roads meant slower travel, higher costs, greater risk of loss. Medieval Europe fragmented into localized economies, each region more self-sufficient by necessity than choice. It took until the 1700s and 1800s for European road networks approaching Roman quality to be rebuilt. 1,000 years or more. Entire millennia, during which moving goods across continents was harder, slower, more expensive than it had been under Roman infrastructure. The engineering knowledge required was substantial. Surveying routes to minimize elevation changes while avoiding unstable ground. Calculating proper drainage to prevent water damage. Standardizing construction methods so roads built in Britain use the same principles as roads in Syria. Training crews in proper techniques. Maintaining completed roads over decades and centuries. This required institutions. Training programs for engineers. Quality standards enforced across vast distances. Sustained funding for construction and maintenance. Administrative systems coordinating thousands of miles of infrastructure. When Roman institutions collapsed, no successor state possessed the organizational capacity to maintain roads at this scale. Medieval kingdoms built local roads connecting nearby towns, but empire-spanning networks maintained to consistent standards, allowing rapid movement across continents. That was lost. The knowledge existed in Roman engineering manuals, some of which survived. But knowledge without institutional support to implement it is just theory. Infrastructure is technology, not in the sense of devices or formulas, but as engineered systems enabling capabilities otherwise impossible. Roman roads enabled rapid military response, swift communication, integrated economics, centralized administration. Without the roads, none of those capabilities functioned properly. When Rome fell, the infrastructure degraded. Roads cracked, drainage failed, bridges collapsed. The entire system that had held an empire together for centuries fragmented. Capabilities declined not because people forgot how to build roads, but because maintaining empire-scale infrastructure requires empire-scale organization. Medieval Europe couldn't maintain what Rome had built. The institutions, the resources, the systematic thinking, all gone. So the roads crumbled, and with them went the easy movement of armies, goods, messages, ideas. Europe fragmented, isolated, localized. The infrastructure that connected a continent disappeared, and rebuilding it took more than a millennium. Roads connected cities, but within those cities, Romans built urban technology that wouldn't be matched for over a millennium. Specifically, they understood something about crowd control, entertainment engineering, and public spectacle that modern stadium designers still study today. Walk across the Colosseum's arena floor today, and you're walking on what used to be a stage. But the real theatre, the machinery that made spectacles possible, sits below. Descend into the hypogeum, and you enter a different world. Corridors branch in all directions. Chambers open into larger spaces. Ramps angle upward toward trapdoors in what was once the arena surface above. This wasn't storage. This was a machine for entertainment. A complex system designed to create impossibility. Trapdoors could open suddenly anywhere on the arena floor. Animals would appear as if from nowhere. Lions, bears, exotic creatures from across the empire. The crowd would gasp at the sudden emergence, not knowing that below, handlers had positioned the animals precisely, timing the release for maximum dramatic impact. Elevators lifted scenery from the hypogeum to arena level. Not simple platforms, sophisticated mechanisms powered by human and animal labor, turning capstans, using rope and pulley systems to raise loads smoothly, steadily. Entire set pieces could rise through the floor, transforming the arena from empty sand to elaborate backdrop in moments. The coordination required was remarkable. Imagine staging a mock hunt with multiple animals released from different locations simultaneously. Each trapdoor needed to open at precisely the right moment, each animal positioned correctly beforehand. Handlers underground operating in near darkness, following rehearsed timing, executing choreography the audience above would never see. Or imagine a dramatic reveal, an entire scene rising from below while the crowd watches, not quite understanding how something so large appears so suddenly. The machinery below working perfectly, invisibly, creating theatrical magic through engineering precision. The Colosseum held between 50 and 80,000 spectators. Managing that many people required sophisticated design. 80 entrances, each marked and designated for specific social classes. Entry was organized, efficient. Modern stadium designers study the Colosseum's crowd flow mechanics because they remain among the best ever implemented. The entire structure could empty in minutes. Tens of thousands of people evacuating without crushes, bottlenecks, or dangerous crowding. The acoustics were equally sophisticated. The elliptical shape and specific proportions meant spectators throughout the structure could hear what happened on the arena floor. No amplification, no speakers, just geometry and an understanding of how sound waves propagate, reflect, and dissipate. Even in the highest seats, far from the action, spectators could hear combat, announcements, the sounds of spectacle. The velarium, retractable awning protecting spectators from sun and rain, represented another engineering marvel. Massive fabric roof managed by teams of sailors who specialized in rigging. They'd learned their trade on ships, working with ropes and canvas in conditions where mistakes meant drowning. At the Colosseum, they applied those same skills to managing a roof covering, most of a structure built for 50,000 people. Building this took less than a decade. Construction began under Vespasian around 70 CE, completed under his son Titus in 80 CE. 10 years, maybe less, to create a structure of such complexity. The project management alone required coordinating hundreds of specialized workers: architects, engineers, carpenters, metal workers, concrete specialists, decorators. Each group needed to work in sequence or parallel, depending on the construction phase, with no confusion, no major delays, no catastrophic mistakes. When Rome fell, the knowledge of building such structures vanished. Medieval amphitheaters and theaters were simpler affairs, some large, some impressive, but none combined the mechanical sophistication with crowd management systems, with acoustic engineering that the Colosseum integrated seamlessly. The re-emergence of comparable entertainment venues waited until the 19th century. Industrial Revolution technology, steel construction, electric lighting, powered machinery, enabled new theatrical capabilities. But even then, the integration of systems, the understanding of crowd psychology and flow, the attention to acoustic detail, these had to be relearned or reinvented. Modern stadium designers acknowledge they're not inventing new principles. They're rediscovering what Rome knew. The Colosseum's hypogeum, exposed now for tourists to explore, remains a masterclass in entertainment engineering, a machine built for spectacle that's outlasted the empire that created it. The Colosseum's machinery served entertainment, but Roman engineers built even more sophisticated hydraulic systems for public spectacles. Specifically, they could flood amphitheaters to stage mock naval battles. And we're still not entirely sure how they did it. 46 BCE. Julius Caesar stages a Naumachia, a mock naval battle, in an artificial basin excavated near the Tiber. 2,000 combatants, 4,000 rowers, full-scale warships. Not miniatures or theatrical props, but actual ships, scaled appropriately for the artificial lake, engaging in genuine combat for the entertainment of Rome's citizens. The ships maneuver, ram, board. Men fight and die. These are condemned prisoners and war captives. Their execution transformed into spectacle. The crowd watches from surrounding banks as naval warfare plays out in a basin that didn't exist months earlier, dug specifically for this event, then filled with diverted river water. Caesar's Naumachia was temporary. Augustus went further, creating a permanent Naumachia complex with an artificial lake measuring 1,800 by 1,200 feet, fed by aqueducts, capable of hosting repeated naval spectacles. Emperor Claudius staged a Naumachia on Lake Fucino involving 19,000 fighters. Not a theatrical performance, a full-scale naval engagement, complete with tactics, casualties, and all the chaos of real maritime combat. How did they manage this? The engineering challenges seem overwhelming. Flooding an amphitheater. Some historians believe early versions of the Colosseum were floodable before the hypogeum was constructed, requires waterproofing at massive scale. Where does the water come from? Aqueducts could be diverted, certainly, but that means interrupting normal water supply to the city. The quantities needed were enormous. Where does the water go afterward? You can't leave an amphitheater flooded indefinitely. Drainage systems would need to empty the basin efficiently. The Colosseum sits on relatively high ground, so gravity drainage was feasible, but engineering channels to handle that volume required planning and construction before the structure itself was built. How do you float ships in relatively shallow water? Purpose-built vessels with shallow drafts, presumably. Smaller than open ocean warships, but large enough to appear impressive and handle the combat spectacles required. Designing and building these vessels would have been specialized work. Shipwrights creating craft for conditions no natural body of water could replicate. Water quality becomes an issue. Standing water stagnates, breeds disease, smells terrible. Naumachii needed to either use the water immediately or maintain circulation and freshness. With aqueduct-fed systems, this was manageable. Continuous flow prevented stagnation. But the logistics of managing water on this scale, ensuring safety and sanitation while creating spectacle, required sophistication. We're still reconstructing through inference. The engineering solutions were probably multiple. Temporary wooden barriers could partition areas, creating pools where none existed naturally. Ships designed specifically for Naumachii would have shallow drafts and compact dimensions. Drainage channels built into the structure from initial construction would handle emptying. Aqueduct water diverted for specific events provided the volume needed. But significant questions remain unanswered. Structural water pressure against walls not designed primarily for it. How did they manage that? Coordinating the spectacle itself. Multiple ships, hundreds or thousands of fighters, all confined to a relatively small artificial space, required planning that went beyond just filling a basin with water. The ambition is what astonishes. Romans took their engineering prowess and used it for entertainment, not just functional infrastructure for water supply or waste removal, but theatrical application of hydraulic engineering on scales that served no practical purpose except spectacle. No medieval or early modern European civilization attempted anything comparable. The technology existed in theory. Anyone with Roman texts could read descriptions of Naumachii. But the actual implementation, the organizational capacity to coordinate such events, the willingness to dedicate resources to pure entertainment, these disappeared with Rome. The closest modern equivalent is theme parks. Water rides, wave pools, attractions that manage massive volumes of water for entertainment purposes. But we build these with electric pumps, modern waterproofing materials, computer-controlled systems. Romans did it with gravity-fed water systems, manual labor, Roman concrete and engineering knowledge we've partially reconstructed, but not fully recovered. Detailed technical manuals for Naumachii haven't survived. What we know comes from historical accounts, describing the spectacles and archaeological evidence revealing infrastructure. The specific solutions, exactly how they waterproofed, precisely how they managed drainage, the full technical details, these are gone. We can make informed guesses, construct plausible explanations, but definitive answers died with the engineers who implemented them. Romans flooded amphitheaters to stage naval battles because they could, because their engineering allowed impossibilities. And then, like so much else, the knowledge slipped away, leaving us to wonder exactly how they achieved what historical accounts insist they did. Spectacles like Naumachii required more than engineering. They required understanding human psychology, crowd management, and what we'd now call event production. Romans didn't just build structures. They created experiences that kept populations pacified and entertained. That psychological and political technology was arguably more sophisticated than the physical engineering, and just as lost. Panem et circenses, bread and circuses. The phrase has become shorthand for political manipulation. Keep people fed and entertained, and they won't revolt. But that reduction misses the sophistication of what Romans actually achieved. This wasn't crude distraction. This was systematic social engineering operating at civilizational scale. Public spectacles served multiple purposes simultaneously. They demonstrated imperial power in ways words never could. Only an empire commanding vast resources could afford to flood amphitheaters for mock naval battles, import exotic animals from 3 continents for a single afternoon's entertainment, build permanent structures solely for public amusement. The spectacles were advertisements for empire's strength, reminders that Rome could accomplish impossibilities. They provided shared cultural experiences that unified diverse populations, citizens from different backgrounds, speaking different languages, following different local customs, all gathered in the same space, watching the same spectacle, experiencing collective emotion, cheering together, gasping together, reacting together. These moments created social cohesion that speeches and laws couldn't manufacture. Spectacles served as pressure valves for social tension. Urban populations, packed densely, experiencing the stresses of city life, needed outlets. Better they channel frustration into cheering for gladiators than into street violence or political unrest. The games redirected energy that might otherwise destabilize society. They created patron-client relationships between rulers and populace. Emperors who funded spectacular games gained popularity, loyalty, political capital. The gift was public and visible. Everyone knew who had paid for today's entertainment. This built personal connections between distant rulers and masses who'd never meet them, transforming abstract political authority into something that felt personal and generous. The scale was remarkable. Rome had over 135 public holidays per year, many featuring games or spectacles. The Colosseum hosted events regularly. Other venues across the city provided additional entertainment. This wasn't occasional festival. This was systematic, ongoing provision of free public entertainment as government policy. Admission was usually free, with tickets distributed to citizens based on social rank. The state subsidized spectacles, or wealthy individuals sponsored them as displays of status and generosity. Either way, ordinary citizens attended without payment. Entertainment wasn't a luxury good, it was a public service, like water from aqueducts or security from the military. No modern Western government provides comparable entertainment at state expense on such scale. Public broadcasting, perhaps, comes closest. Tax-funded content available to all citizens. Public parks offer free recreation, but nothing matches the spectacle, the frequency, the centrality of Roman games. No modern leader builds massive venues specifically for distributing free entertainment designed to unified populations and demonstrate state power. The system required specific conditions to function. Immense wealth from conquered provinces provided funding. Political stability meant emperors could safely gather tens of thousands of people without fearing mob violence. Institutional continuity maintained the infrastructure. The buildings, the supply chains for exotic animals, the trained performers. When Rome's economy contracted and security declined, these conditions evaporated. Funding spectacles became impossible when military threats consumed resources. Gathering large crowds became dangerous when political stability fractured. The social technology of managing populations through entertainment simply stopped working. Medieval rulers couldn't replicate it, even if they'd wanted to. They lacked the wealth. No vast tribute from stable provinces. They lacked the infrastructure. No colosseums, no institutional knowledge of staging spectacles. They lacked the security. Assembling thousands of people felt like risk, not political opportunity. Modern states use different tools. Mass media provides entertainment without requiring physical assembly. Consumer culture offers individual pursuits replacing collective spectacle. Welfare systems provide material support without the theatrical patronage Roman games embodied. We found other ways to manage urban populations, other methods of creating social cohesion and relieving tension. But we haven't matched Roman directness. The face-to-face relationship between ruler and ruled, mediated through spectacular gift-giving visible to all, created bonds modern bureaucratic systems can't replicate. Modern politicians appear on screens, distant and abstract. Roman emperors appeared in imperial boxes at games they'd funded, physically present, personally connected to the spectacle and the audience experiencing it. This social technology might be impossible to replicate in modern contexts. It required extreme wealth inequality, absence of competing entertainment options, social structures based on patronage rather than bureaucracy. Society has evolved in ways that make Roman-style bread and circuses obsolete, replaced by different mechanisms for similar purposes. But for 4 centuries, Rome kept 50 million people across 3 continents relatively pacified through systematic provision of food and entertainment. They understood something about managing large populations that we've either forgotten or deliberately moved beyond. Either way, the knowledge is lost. Entertainment technology was impressive, but it pales in comparison to the knowledge Rome lost in one specific field, a field where modern science admits we still haven't matched ancient capabilities in some areas. We're talking about metallurgy, the forging, alloying, and treatment of metals. And when Rome fell, the furnaces went cold, and the formulas were forgotten. Damascus steel blades are legendary. Museums hold examples dating back centuries. Curved swords with distinctive watery patterns rippling across their surfaces. The steel was famous for properties that seemed almost magical. Extraordinary strength. Flexibility that let blades bend without breaking. Edges that held sharpness through extended use. Warriors prized these weapons. Smiths guarded the forging techniques jealously. Around 1750, the technique was lost. The last smiths who knew the complete process died without successfully transmitting their knowledge. For over 2 centuries, Damascus steel remained a mystery. Beautiful artifacts we could examine but not reproduce. Then electron microscopes revealed something impossible. The steel contained carbon nanotubes and carbide nanowires, structures measured in nanometers, invisible to the naked eye, embedded throughout the metal matrix. These nanostructures gave Damascus steel its legendary properties: the strength, the flexibility, the edge retention. Nanostructures don't occur naturally in forged metal. Creating them requires manipulating material at molecular scales. Technology we developed in the late 20th century, with sophisticated equipment and deep understanding of materials science. Yet there they are, in blades forged centuries ago by smiths who didn't know atoms existed, let alone how to arrange them. How? The answer involves specific ore sources, likely from India, containing trace elements that acted as catalysts during forging. Temperature control during heating and cooling created conditions where carbon organized into these nanostructures accidentally. The smiths didn't understand what they were creating at the molecular level. They just knew certain ores, heated precisely, cooled correctly, produced superior steel. They perfected the technique through generations of empirical refinement. We can make Damascus-like steel now. Modern metallurgists have developed processes producing similar nanostructures deliberately, but we're not certain our steel exactly matches the original. The techniques differ, the understanding differs, and subtle variations might create subtle differences we haven't detected yet. Damascus steel came from the Near East, not Rome. But Romans had sophisticated metallurgy too. Different techniques, different applications, but comparable sophistication. Roman iron was consistently lower in impurities than early medieval iron because Romans had better smelting processes, higher temperature furnaces, better understanding of slag removal, more refined techniques. They understood carburization, adding carbon to iron to create steel with desired properties. They knew quenching, rapid cooling that hardened steel for cutting edges. They practiced annealing, controlled cooling that reduced brittleness and prevented cracking. These aren't simple techniques. Each requires understanding how heat and chemistry interact, how different cooling rates affect crystalline structure, how carbon content changes mechanical properties. Roman swords, armor, and tools were generally superior to early medieval equivalents. Better tempering meant weapons that held edges longer. More consistent quality meant predictable performance. Standardized production methods meant Roman equipment didn't vary wildly between different workshops. A sword forged in Hispania met the same standards as one made in Syria. This knowledge was craft knowledge, transmitted master to apprentice through demonstration and practice. How hot the metal should glow, how it sounds when ready for quenching, the feel of properly tempered steel under the hammer. Knowledge that lived in hands and senses, not in written formulas. When Roman trade networks collapsed, smiths lost access to premium ore sources. When economic activity declined, demand for high-quality metalwork dropped. Fewer customers meant fewer master smiths could support themselves training apprentices. The knowledge chain broke within generations. By 600 or 700 CE, techniques that had been standard practice were already becoming obscure. Medieval metallurgy had to rediscover much of this through trial and error. Some knowledge survived in fragments. Smiths who remembered pieces of techniques, texts describing outcomes without explaining processes, but comprehensive understanding was gone. Steel production reaching Roman quality levels didn't re-emerge until late medieval or early Renaissance period. 800 to 1,000 years of rediscovery, relearning what had been lost. Ancient smiths created nanostructures accidentally, through techniques they understood empirically, but not theoretically. Modern science can analyze these structures, understand them, even replicate them. But we're still not certain we've recovered exactly how they did it. The blades exist. The nanostructures are measurable. The complete technique remains partially mysterious. Steel and iron were crucial, but Rome's mastery extended to other metals, especially copper, bronze, lead, and gold. Their alloying techniques and precision metallurgy are still being studied. In some cases, we've found metal objects we can analyze, but can't fully recreate. Bronze is copper mixed with tin. Simple formula, known for thousands of years. But the proportions matter enormously. 10% tin creates different bronze than 15% tin. Add traces of other elements and properties, change again. Romans understood this systematically. Statuary bronze used higher tin content for better casting detail. The metal flowed more easily into molds, captured finer features, produced sharper definition in finished sculptures. Ship bronze resisted seawater corrosion better, essential for fittings, fasteners, components constantly exposed to salt water. Symbol bronze had specific elasticity, producing desired sound qualities. Too stiff and the tone goes flat, too soft and it deadens. Each application had optimized formulas, not accidental variations, but deliberate compositional choices based on understanding how metal properties related to intended use. Analysis of Roman bronze artifacts reveals this sophistication. The tin ratios aren't random. The trace elements, zinc, lead, silver in small quantities, appear deliberately added, improving workability or enhancing specific characteristics. Some Roman bronzes remain puzzling. Modern metallurgists analyzing ancient artifacts occasionally find alloys they struggle to replicate precisely. The composition is measurable. We know exactly what's in them. But creating identical bronze using period-appropriate techniques proves difficult. Temperature during casting matters. Cooling rate affects crystalline structure. Small variations in process create different final properties, even with identical composition. Roman gold work demonstrates similar sophistication. Pure gold is too soft for most practical applications. It's alloyed with silver, copper, or other metals to increase hardness and durability. Roman coins show remarkably consistent gold purity across vast geographic areas. A coin minted in Rome contained the same gold percentage as one from Alexandria or Britannia. This required standardized assaying techniques, methods for testing gold content accurately, and quality control, ensuring standards were maintained empire-wide. They produced electrum, gold-silver alloy, with precise proportions. They understood depletion gilding, a technique where gold-copper alloy is treated with acid. The acid removes copper from the surface, leaving a thin layer of pure gold. The object appears solid gold, but uses less precious metal. This required chemical knowledge, understanding which acids affected which metals, controlling concentration and exposure time. Roman lead refining was equally sophisticated. They used lead extensively in pipes, cosmetics, cookware. We now know this caused widespread lead poisoning, a public health disaster Romans didn't understand. But technically, their lead work was impressive. They extracted silver from lead ore through cupellation, a process requiring precise temperature control. Heat lead ore with air exposure, and the lead oxidizes, leaving purified silver. Too cool, and the process doesn't complete. Too hot, and you lose silver to volatilization. Roman refiners maintained optimal temperatures consistently. They soldered lead pipes with tin lead solder at ratios similar to modern solder, approximately 60% tin, 40% lead. This specific composition melts at lower temperature than either pure metal, flows well, creates strong joints. Romans determined these ratios empirically, testing different mixtures until finding optimal performance. Metallurgy isn't just knowing metals exist, it's understanding extraction from ore, which rocks contain metal, how to separate metal from stone, how to achieve required purity. It's understanding alloying, how different elements interact, which combinations produce desired properties, what proportions work best. It's understanding working, how to cast, forge, weld, finish metal into functional forms. This requires chemistry, even if practitioners didn't conceptualize it as chemistry. It requires pyrotechnology, managing heat precisely. It requires empirical testing, trying variations, observing results, refining techniques based on outcomes. When Roman metallurgical centers closed, mines in Hispania, smelters in Britannia, refineries in Italy, this accumulated knowledge scattered. Some smiths survived, carrying fragments of technique. But comprehensive, systematic understanding requires institutions, training centers, standardized practices, continuous refinement across generations. Without those, metallurgy reverted to simpler methods. Medieval smiths had access to Roman artifacts. They could examine bronze statues, analyze gold coins, study lead pipes. But reverse engineering is difficult without understanding underlying principles. You can measure composition, but that doesn't reveal forging temperature, cooling rate, specific techniques that created the artifact. Some Roman metal objects remain incompletely understood. We've analyzed them thoroughly, measured every element, determined precise composition. But creating identical items using period-appropriate techniques challenges modern metallurgists. We're missing something, some detail of process, some technique they used that we haven't rediscovered. The formulas exist in the artifacts themselves. The knowledge is there, encoded in metal. But knowledge without context, without the full process, without the craft tradition that created it, remains frustratingly incomplete. We can see what they made. We struggle to fully understand how. Metallurgy required another technology that Romans mastered and then Europe lost. Controlled, sustained high heat. The furnaces, kilns, and forges that made Roman industry possible were sophisticated machines themselves. And when they went cold, they stayed cold for centuries. Fire is easy. Sustained, controlled, high-temperature heat is not. The difference separates primitive metalworking from sophisticated metallurgy, crude pottery from fine ceramics, basic construction from Roman concrete and glass. Iron ore smelting requires temperatures exceeding 1200 degrees Celsius. Wood fires don't reach that temperature naturally. Romans achieved it through engineered furnaces, carefully designed structures with forced air from bellows, proper fuel selection, and refractory linings that withstood sustained heat without degrading. The furnaces incorporated multiple sophisticated elements. Air intake positioning created proper draft, pulling oxygen through fuel, achieving complete combustion. Fuel choice mattered. Different woods produced different heat. Charcoal from oak, beech, or other dense hardwoods burned hotter and more consistently than softwoods. Refractory bricks lining furnace interiors resisted heat without cracking or melting, maintaining structural integrity through repeated heating cycles. These furnaces could maintain high temperature for hours or days, essential for efficient smelting. Achieving temperature is one thing. Maintaining it consistently while processing ore, removing slag, managing the continuous operation is another. Roman furnace design made this possible through understanding thermodynamics they couldn't articulate theoretically, but had mastered practically. Lime production required similar sophistication. Making lime for cement and plaster involves heating limestone to specific temperatures. Too cool, and the chemical conversion doesn't complete. Too hot, and the lime overburns, becoming useless. Roman lime kilns achieved consistent results across the empire through standardized designs and operational knowledge. How to load the kiln, when to add fuel, how to judge temperature by observation when the process was complete. The most visible application of Roman heating technology was hypocaust systems, underfloor heating for baths and villas. These weren't simple fires under floors. They were engineered climate control systems centuries ahead of their time. Hypocausts used pillars, pilae, supporting raised floors. Hot air from furnaces circulated through the space between ground level and floor above, heating from below. Flues in walls directed heat upward, warming rooms evenly. Venting systems removed smoke and prevented dangerous accumulation. The entire system provided controllable, efficient heating without filling rooms with smoke or requiring dangerous open flames in living spaces. Fuel efficiency was remarkable. Hypocausts heated large spaces with modest fuel consumption because intelligent design maximized heat transfer and retention. Heat distributed evenly rather than concentrating near the fire source. Thermal mass, the stone and concrete construction, retained heat long after fires died down, providing warmth for hours. When Rome fell, hypocaust technology vanished from Western Europe. Medieval buildings reverted to fireplaces, inefficient, smoky, providing only localized heat. Stand near a medieval fireplace and you're warm. Step away and you're cold. Most of the heat goes up the chimney. Smoke fills rooms unless ventilation is adequate. It's crude technology compared to hypocaust systems that heated entire buildings evenly without smoke intrusion. Central heating didn't re-emerge in Europe until the 19th century Industrial Revolution. Steam radiators, hot water systems, eventually forced air heating. 1400 years or more between Roman hypocausts and comparable heating technology. Interestingly, Roman-style hypocausts survived in some Islamic bathhouses, suggesting the Eastern Mediterranean retained this knowledge, while Western Europe lost it. Why did pyrotechnology knowledge disappear? Building efficient furnaces and kilns required specialized understanding, draft dynamics, fuel-to-air ratios, refractory materials, heat retention, temperature control. This was expert knowledge, not common practice. When demand for industrial-scale production declined, Less glass-making, less large-scale metallurgy, less lime production for massive construction projects. Master furnace builders had no work. Without demand, there was no reason to train apprentices in sophisticated techniques. The knowledge chain broke. Medieval craftsmen used simpler, less efficient heating systems, partly because they'd forgotten how to build better ones, and partly because they didn't need Roman-scale production. Localized economies with limited trade didn't require industrial output. Small-scale production used small-scale furnaces. The knowledge of building high-performance heating systems became unnecessary and was abandoned. This illustrates a recurring theme. High technology requires high demand and economic support. When Roman market integration collapsed and empire-wide industry fragmented into local production, sophisticated technology became obsolete. It wasn't just forgotten, it was abandoned as unnecessary. Then the knowledge died from disuse. Furnaces, kilns, hypercausts, the foundational heating technology that enabled everything from glass to concrete to steel, went cold, and stayed cold for centuries, until technological development eventually recreated what Rome had achieved and lost. We've explored what Rome lost: concrete formulas, glass techniques, medical knowledge, astronomical calculations, metallurgical secrets, and so much more. But the question remains: why did all this vanish so completely? And could it happen again? The answers are unsettling. Knowledge is more fragile than we like to believe. Not in the abstract sense. The universe's laws don't change. Mathematical truths remain constant. But human knowledge, the accumulated understanding of how to do things, how to make things, how to solve problems, that knowledge exists only as long as people preserve it. Rome's knowledge existed in three forms: written texts, craft knowledge, and institutional memory. When Rome fell, all three failed simultaneously. Written texts seem permanent. Scroll, codex, book, words on material surfaces, preserved for future generations. Except papyrus decays. In decades without proper storage, papyrus crumbles to dust. Parchment lasts longer, but requires specific conditions: controlled humidity, protection from pests, careful handling. Leave parchment unattended in a library nobody maintains, and it deteriorates within generations. Before printing, texts were rare and expensive. Each copy required a scribe spending weeks or months transcribing by hand. A single engineering manual might exist in 3 copies total. If 2 burn and the third decays, the knowledge vanishes. No backup servers, no cloud storage, just physical objects vulnerable to fire, water, neglect, and time. Craft knowledge was worse. The feel of properly tempered steel, the sound iron makes when hot enough for forging, the precise moment to add flux to glass, the technique for mixing concrete that would last millennia. These lived in hands and senses, transmitted through years of apprenticeship. Master to student, demonstration and practice. Knowledge that couldn't be fully written because words fail to capture physical skill. When economic collapse broke the guild system, when demand disappeared and masters couldn't support apprentices, this knowledge died within a generation. Nobody to teach, nobody to learn. The techniques simply stopped being practiced and were forgotten. Institutional knowledge is subtler. Organizations develop collective understanding, exceeding any individual member's knowledge. Engineering schools where students learned principles across disciplines. Medical schools preserving anatomical knowledge. Military academies teaching logistics and strategy. These institutions held knowledge in their practices, their cultures, their accumulated wisdom. When institutions collapsed, schools closed, academies disbanded, systematic training ended. Even knowledge that survived in texts became unusable. Medieval scholars could read Galen, but couldn't apply his methods without the institutional framework of dissection, observation, and empirical testing that Roman medical schools provided. The destruction was both catastrophic and gradual. Libraries burned in specific moments. Alexandria's destruction, though historians debate exactly when and how completely, symbolizes knowledge lost in fires nobody could stop or didn't bother fighting. Rome's sack scattered texts that were looted, damaged, or simply abandoned. Plague and warfare depopulated cities, leaving libraries unattended to decay naturally. But gradual neglect destroyed more. Without institutional commitment to preservation, texts simply rotted. Without economic support, craftsmen stopped practicing their trades. Without political stability, systematic education ended. Much Roman knowledge survived only through accident of Arabic translation. Islamic scholars during the Golden Age, 8th through 13th centuries, translated Greek and Latin texts into Arabic. When European interest revived during the 12th century Renaissance, scholars often learned from Arabic translations of texts written in their own ancestral languages. Without that Arabic preservation, vast amounts of knowledge would have died permanently. The parallel to our own time is uncomfortable. Our knowledge lives digitally now. Servers, hard drives, cloud storage, all requiring continuous electrical power. What happens if electromagnetic pulses destroy electronics? If cyber attacks corrupt data? If infrastructure failures cascade through power grids? Hard drives don't function without electricity. Digital storage degrades over time, even with power. File formats become obsolete. Without active maintenance, digital knowledge could evaporate faster than papyrus scrolls decayed in neglected Roman libraries. We assume knowledge, once discovered, is permanent. That discovering something once means humanity always possesses that knowledge. Rome proves that assumption false. Knowledge requires active preservation, institutional support, cultural value, deliberate effort. When those disappear, knowledge follows surprisingly quickly, sometimes within a single generation. The time between a master craftsman teaching the last apprentice and that apprentice dying without training successors, maybe 40 years. Long enough that the knowledge seems secure, short enough that complacency is fatal. Rome lost centuries of accumulated knowledge in decades because nobody realized it needed protection until too late. Our knowledge lives on electricity and servers. What happens if those fail? But Rome's fall wasn't just about lost knowledge. It was about lost systems. Technologies don't exist in isolation. They're parts of interconnected systems. When those systems collapse, even knowledge that survives becomes unusable. Rome's real loss wasn't individual technologies, but the entire technological ecosystem that supported them. Think about Roman concrete. not just as a formula, volcanic ash, lime, seawater, but as a system. The formula required specific volcanic ash from specific sources near Naples. That required quarries operating, extracting the right material. Transportation networks moving ash from quarries to construction sites across the empire. Ships, roads, ports, logistics. It required skilled workers who understood proportions, mixing, application. Training institutions teaching those skills. Master-apprentice relationships, transmitting practical knowledge. Quality control, ensuring consistency. It required funding. State capacity to tax provinces and allocate resources to public works. Economic surplus supporting specialized labor. Political will to undertake massive projects. It required demand. Reasons to build aqueducts, harbors, bathhouses at scales justifying sophisticated materials. Without demand, no reason to maintain supply chains or train workers. Remove any single component and the system weakens. Remove several simultaneously and it collapses entirely. When Rome fell, every component failed at once. Trade networks fragmented. Tax collection ceased. Training institutions closed. Economic surplus evaporated. Demand for massive infrastructure disappeared. Even if medieval Europeans had perfect texts describing Roman concrete, which they didn't, they couldn't recreate it. They lacked access to the specific volcanic ash because trade routes were disrupted. They couldn't organize labor at Roman scales because institutional capacity was gone. They didn't need aqueducts for cities of thousands when Roman cities had held hundreds of thousands or millions. Technology isn't just knowledge. It's knowledge plus resources plus organization plus demand plus the institutional framework supporting all of those. When systems collapse, technology becomes impossible, even when knowledge survives. This created cascading failures. Roman Empire's integration was its strength. Specialization meant high efficiency. Tin from Britain, copper from Cyprus, combined into bronze in workshops across the empire. Grain from Egypt fed Rome. Spanish silver funded legions defending Danube frontiers. Everything connected, interdependent, optimized for empire-scale operations. But interconnection created vulnerability. Disruption anywhere rippled throughout the system. When Germanic tribes disrupted Rhine trade routes, workshops lost access to materials. When African provinces were lost, grain supplies failed. When silver mines closed, military funding collapsed. Each failure weakened everything else. Compare medieval Europe's localized economy. More resilient to local disruptions because communities were self-sufficient. If one region suffered, others continued functioning independently. But this resilience came at cost. Lower technological capability, because specialization and scale were impossible. You can't build aqueducts spanning hundreds of miles when your economy serves a few villages. Civilizations don't usually collapse from single causes. Rome didn't fall just from barbarian invasions or just from economic problems or just from plague. Multiple simultaneous stresses overwhelmed adaptive capacity. Economic strain from maintaining military defenses. Military pressure from Germanic migrations. Disease. Antonine plague. Plague of Cyprian. depopulating regions, political instability, fragmenting authority, climate changes during late antique Little Ice Age, stressing agriculture. Any one challenge was manageable. Combined, they broke the system's ability to adapt. And once systems break, reconstruction is exponentially harder than preservation would have been. Even knowledge surviving on paper became dark knowledge, theoretically available but practically inaccessible. Medieval scholars read Roman engineering texts but couldn't implement them because economic and organizational prerequisites didn't exist. Knowing how Romans built aqueducts didn't help when you lacked the institutional capacity to survey routes, organize labor, fund construction, and maintain infrastructure over decades. Our own systems are more integrated than Rome's. Global supply chains make Roman trade networks look simple. Just-in-time manufacturing means no reserves, no redundancy. Electrical grids spanning continents mean single points of failure affecting millions. Internet infrastructure creates dependencies we barely understand. Specialized expertise fragments knowledge so thoroughly that no individual understands complete systems. This integration creates efficiency. Rome couldn't imagine, but it also creates vulnerability. Disruption cascades faster through more tightly coupled systems. When everything depends on everything else, failure anywhere threatens failure everywhere. Modern civilization faces multiple simultaneous stresses too. Climate change stressing agricultural systems and displacing populations. Economic inequality, creating political instability. Pandemic risks demonstrated recently. Aging infrastructure requiring replacement. International tensions disrupting cooperation. Resource depletion as easily accessible materials run out. No single challenge is insurmountable, but combined, they test adaptive capacity. And if systems break, if global supply chains fragment, if internet infrastructure fails, if institutional knowledge disappears, reconstruction might take centuries. Just like after Rome. Rome didn't just lose technologies. It lost the entire system making those technologies possible. And systems, once broken, are exponentially harder to rebuild than individual technologies, which raises a final unsettling question. Could it happen again? And if it did, how much of our own knowledge would survive? Imagine a catastrophic collapse scenario, not specified. Maybe pandemic, maybe war, maybe economic crisis, maybe climate disaster, maybe some combination overwhelming adaptive capacity. Modern civilization disrupted the way barbarian invasions and plague disrupted Rome. What knowledge would we lose? Digital knowledge goes first. Vast amounts of information exist only digitally. No physical backup, no paper copies, just data on servers. Electromagnetic pulses from solar storms or nuclear weapons destroy electronics instantly. Cyber attacks corrupt data. Infrastructure failures mean servers can't function. Unlike parchment surviving in abandoned libraries for centuries, hard drives fail within years without power. Technical manuals for manufacturing everything from antibiotics to microprocessors. Scientific research accumulated over decades. Engineering specifications for infrastructure. All digital. All vulnerable. Specialized expertise is worse. Modern technology requires extreme specialization. How many people understand complete microprocessor manufacturing, from silicon purification through lithography to chip packaging, maybe thousands globally, all depending on institutional frameworks training them. If those institutions disappear, if those experts die or scatter, can we recreate capabilities from documentation alone? Roman concrete was lost despite written descriptions, because craft knowledge was essential. Same principle applies. Reading about microprocessor manufacturing doesn't convey the tacit knowledge, the practice skill, the troubleshooting intuition experts possess. Supply chain dependencies create additional vulnerability. Smartphones contain materials from dozens of countries, rare earth elements from specific mines, precision components from specialized manufacturers. If global trade collapses, if ships stop moving, if borders close, regional populations lose access to technologies dependent on unavailable resources. You might know how to make a smartphone, but without coltan from Congo, without rare earths from China, without precision machinery from Japan, knowledge becomes useless. Technology requires resources plus organization, not just information. Institutional knowledge fragments fastest. Pharmaceutical development depends on teams, chemists, biologists, manufacturing specialists, quality control experts, working together with accumulated organizational knowledge exceeding any individual's understanding. Dissolve the institution, and that collective intelligence shatters into pieces nobody can reassemble alone. Same for aerospace engineering, nuclear technology, advanced medicine. These exist as much in organizational practices as documented procedures. Written manuals can't capture institutional culture, team coordination, accumulated wisdom about what works. Some efforts at preservation exist. Long now foundation, thinking about 10,000-year timescales. Svalbard Global Seed Vault, protecting agricultural diversity. Data archiving initiatives, preserving information in multiple formats and locations. But these are marginal, small-scale responses to enormous vulnerability. We lack comprehensive backup plans for technological civilization's knowledge base. This isn't inevitable doomsaying. Collapse is possible but not certain. Vulnerability exists, but so does resilience. Modern civilization has advantages. Rome lacked. Printing means knowledge isn't locked in rare manuscripts. Global communication enables rapid information sharing. Diverse societies mean some regions might preserve what others lose. But complacency is dangerous too. Assuming it can't happen to us because we're more advanced ignores that Rome was more advanced than what followed. Assuming knowledge is permanent because we discovered it once ignores how much Rome lost. Assuming systems will persist because they're complex ignores that complexity creates fragility as well as capability. Rome's lost technologies aren't just historical curiosities. They're warnings. Knowledge is fragile. Systems are vulnerable. Progress isn't irreversible. Civilizations can and do forget essential knowledge, sometimes within single generations, sometimes spending centuries recovering what was lost. The best defense is understanding how knowledge was lost before, recognizing warning signs, deliberately building resilience, redundant systems, preserved physical documentation, training across disciplines, maintaining institutional memory, valuing long-term preservation over short-term efficiency, and acknowledging that it could happen again, not inevitably, not immediately, but possibly, if we're not thoughtful about maintaining the systems supporting knowledge. If we let institutions decay, if we assume knowledge preserves itself automatically, look at the Pantheon standing in Rome, concrete dome intact after 19 centuries. The Colosseum's arches, still impressive despite medieval scavenging. Aqueducts marching across landscapes, some still carrying water. Monuments to capabilities that outlasted the knowledge creating them. These structures remain while the wisdom that built them vanished. Physical artifacts surviving, knowledge lost. Will future people stand in our ruins 2,000 years from now, looking at monuments we built, wondering what we knew and how we lost it? That question lingers, unanswered, uncomfortable, necessary. Because remembering Rome's loss might help us avoid our own.